A millionaire was walking through a hotel lobby when a little girl stopped him with a sentence so unexpected it froze him mid-step and changed everything. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The grand chandeliers of the Rosenthal Hotel glimmered like captured starlight, illuminating every polished marble surface below. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, and the lobby bustled with a steady stream of travelers, families returning from vacation, business people checking in for important meetings, and the occasional curious tourist stepping in just to marvel at the grandeur. Seated on one of the plush emerald sofas, Christopher Langford scrolled through emails on his phone, his expression one of cool detachment. He was here for a quick stopover, no more than a night or two, before flying off to finalize an acquisition that would cement his status as one of the country's most influential investors. Christopher was used to expensive hotels. He practically lived in them, traveling from city to city, always in pursuit of another lucrative deal. At just 40 years old, he had amassed a fortune that allowed him luxuries beyond most people's imagination. Interviews on primetime television dubbed him the Visionary Tycoon, a moniker he'd learned to wear with indifferent acceptance. Everyone wanted to know how he made his millions. Few cared to ask about the shadows behind that meteoric rise. He stifled a sigh as he took in the lavish surroundings. None of this truly impressed him anymore. Not the marble pillars, not the gilded decor, not the high-end perfume swirling in the air. What had once thrilled him, recognition, success, comfort, now felt routine. The ring of a distant bellhop's cart and the muffled chatter of guests drifted through his subconscious white noise to his business-oriented thoughts. That was until he caught sight of a small figure standing near the front desk, barely tall enough to peer over the counter. He noticed the little girl because she seemed utterly out of place. Maybe 7 or 8 years old, she was dressed in a simple yellow sundress with tiny flowers at the hem. Her shoes looked scuffed, the kind a child might wear while playing in a park, rather than strolling through a 5-star hotel lobby. Her hair was tied back in 2 uneven pigtails, and her gaze darted nervously from the gleaming floors to the towering grown-ups rushing by. She clutched a battered backpack to her chest, as though it contained something precious. Christopher couldn't say precisely why his attention locked onto her. Perhaps it was the unguarded fear in her eyes or the solitary way she stood there, obviously without any adult companion. Something about her reminded him of vulnerability, of a kind of loneliness he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. For a moment he tried to brush it off. He was a man on a tight schedule, and he certainly wasn't equipped to handle children's problems. Yet he found himself closing the email app on his phone, rising from the sofa, and making his way toward the lobby's polished reception desk. The young concierge behind the counter, clad in a neat black blazer, was speaking softly to the girl. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, "but I can't let you wander around without a guardian. Is your mom or dad staying here?" The girl shook her head, pigtails swaying slightly. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. I'm looking for someone, a man named Christopher Langford." At that, Christopher paused mid-step, heart giving a single hard thump. He was fairly certain he hadn't misheard. How could this child possibly know his name? A jolt of confusion rippled through him as he slowly approached. "I'm Christopher Langford," he announced. "Is everything all right?" Her eyes flicked to his, wide with trepidation and hope. She looked at him for several seconds as if trying to decide whether he was real. Up close, he noticed she had a sprinkle of freckles across her cheeks and an expression too grave for someone so young. The hotel concierge, visibly relieved, gestured toward him. "There you go, miss. Mr. Langford is here." She took a small step forward, hugging the backpack. "My name's Rosie," she said, voice trembling slightly. I came here because..." She paused as though the words tangled on her tongue. Well, I think you might know my mother. A wave of stunned silence washed over Christopher. His mind raced. Did she mention a name? Had he ever met anyone who could have a child this age, someone who might send a little girl after him? He swallowed hard, remembering relationships from his past that ended quietly, or sometimes messily, once business overshadowed everything else. He cleared his throat. I'm sorry, Rosie, but I'm not sure. Who is your mother? The girl's gaze dropped to the floor, and when she spoke, it sounded as though she were reciting a name she'd practiced. Her name was Layla Turner, she said slowly. She told me if I ever needed help, I should find you. Christopher froze. Layla Turner. The name struck him like an echo from another lifetime. She had been a journalist, sharp-witted and passionate, who once interviewed him for a financial publication. They dated briefly afterward. It hadn't lasted. He was too consumed by ambition back then, too unwilling to let anyone slow him down. He hadn't seen her in almost 8 years, hadn't thought about her beyond the occasional memory. Suddenly he found it hard to breathe. Layla Turner, he repeated, voice stiff. Yes, I knew her, but I haven't spoken to her in a very long time. Questions crowded his thoughts. Why would Layla have told her daughter to find him? Where was Layla now? The little girl looked down at her shoes. She said that if anything happened to her and if she couldn't take care of me anymore, I should ask you. She said you were the only person who might help. Christopher's world shifted, the grand pillars and shimmering chandeliers momentarily fading into the background. Layla was a fiercely independent woman, never one to lean on others, especially not him. For her to say something like that, it suggested a desperation he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He noticed Rosie's eyes brimming with tears she was trying so hard to hold back. Suddenly, his heart twisted. He might have been a man of cold logic for most of his adult life, but seeing a child on the verge of heartbreak left him feeling uncharacteristically protective. He turned to the concierge, who was politely pretending not to hear any of this. I'll handle things from here, Christopher said quietly. Then, gesturing toward the plush sofas in the corner, he guided Rosie away from the gawking eyes of hotel guests. They sat down, Rosie fidgeting with her backpack strap. Up close, Christopher realized just how small she was, how her entire demeanor spoke of anxiety, layered over exhaustion. Rosie, he began gently, where's your mother now? A tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. She passed away 2 weeks ago. Her voice cracked at the final words. I was staying with a neighbor for a while, but she had to leave, so I came here. In that instant, Christopher felt as though someone had punched him in the chest. Layla was gone. There would be no phone call to confirm this story, no chance to ask her the questions swirling through his mind. Gone, just like that. He remembered Layla's laugh, her sharp comebacks, the way she could turn a tense interview into a conversation that flowed like water. And now she had left behind a daughter he'd never even known existed. Rosie's tiny frame trembled as she tried to keep herself composed. Christopher reached out awkwardly, placing a hand on her shoulder. It had been years since he'd offered comfort to anyone in such a straightforward way. I'm sorry, he managed, the words sounding hollow to his own ears. I didn't realize Layla had a child. For a long moment, Rosie said nothing. Then she admitted in a small voice, she didn't talk about you much, but one night I heard her crying. She was really sad, and she kept saying she regretted pushing you away, that maybe if she had told you, things would have been different. Christopher inhaled sharply. Layla had regretted pushing him away. The complicated swirl of guilt and confusion in his chest made it difficult to formulate a response. His rational mind reeled at the implications, a child who might have been connected to him in some way. Yet Rosie had introduced herself as Layla's daughter, without suggesting that he was her father. That question alone lodged itself in his mind with a quiet, insistent buzz. "Rosie," he said carefully, did your mother ever mention anything about me being related to you?" He felt a fool for voicing the thought so directly, but it needed to be asked. She blinked, those freckled cheeks flushing as she shook her head. "No. She never said you were my dad. She just said you were someone she cared about, someone who might help me if I had nowhere else to go." The strangest mixture of relief and disappointment coursed through him. He wasn't certain he was ready to handle fatherhood. Yet the idea that perhaps Layla had once considered telling him about Rosie wouldn't let him go. Why had Layla believed Christopher was the only person who might help her daughter now? He pressed his palms against his knees, trying to steady himself. "Rosie, do you have any other family? Grandparents, aunts, uncles?" She shook her head. "My grandparents died before I was born. Mom didn't have any brothers or sisters." A flicker of fear crossed her face. "I don't know what to do now. The neighbor who looked after me said I had to leave because she couldn't afford to keep me. She gave me money for a bus ticket and told me to come here. She said you were really rich and would know what to do." Rich? Yes, that was a word that always clung to him like a label. Wealthy, prosperous. But as Christopher sat there in the rosy glow of the hotel's chandeliers, he realized how useless that label felt when it came to comforting a frightened child. Money could buy solutions, but it couldn't bring back a mother or erase Rosie's grief. He glanced around, noticing the curious gazes of other guests who pretended not to stare. Rosie, hugging her backpack, looked as if she might bolt at any second if someone spoke too harshly. Christopher realized it was up to him to figure out the next step. The caretaker in him, one he wasn't sure existed, stirred unexpectedly. He rose to his feet, motioning for Rosie to follow him. "Come on," he said. "We're not going to figure anything out sitting in the middle of a hotel lobby." She stood, clinging to his side with hesitant trust, as if he was the only flicker of stability she had left. They walked through the gleaming halls toward the private elevator that would take them to the penthouse suite Christopher had booked. As they rode up in silence, Rosie's breathing grew uneven, and he could sense her nerves unraveling. Once the doors slid open onto the quiet corridor, he guided her inside the spacious suite, flipping on the lights that revealed a modern living area and an impressive skyline view. Rosie stepped in cautiously, eyes darting between the sleek furniture and the giant windows overlooking the city's glittering expanse. Everything about the place screamed money. The plush cream carpets, the expensive artwork on the walls, the subtle fragrance of fresh-cut flowers delivered daily. She seemed overwhelmed, and Christopher couldn't blame her. Life as he knew it was about to change, whether he liked it or not. He set her backpack on a nearby chair, then turned to face her. "We can stay here tonight," he said gently, "and figure things out in the morning. You must be tired. Do you want something to eat?" She nodded quietly, shoulders sagging. He ordered room service, requesting a simple meal suitable for a child. While waiting, he watched Rosie stare out the window at the sea of lights below. He realized how surreal this must be for her. A little girl left adrift by tragedy, turning up on the doorstep of a man her mother once cared about. When the food arrived, Rosie thanked him in a whisper. She ate only a few bites of the sandwich, fatigue etched into every movement. After she finished, he showed her to the suite's second bedroom, a sprawling guest chamber that dwarfed anything she might have known before. Rosie gazed at the plush bed, looking unsure, as though it might vanish if she blinked too hard. Before he shut off the lights, Christopher hesitated in the doorway. "Rosie, I know it's scary right now, but I promise we'll find a safe place for you. If you want me to help, I will. You're not alone anymore." She nodded, a single tear trailing down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. He left her with that quiet gratitude hanging in the air. Outside, he leaned against the wall, heart pounding. Images of Layla flooded his mind, her smile, her passionate sense of justice, the sudden breakup that left him questioning more than he ever admitted. Now Layla was gone, and her daughter stood in the next room, trusting Christopher to do right by her mother's dying wish. The city lights sparkled in the penthouse windows, but for once, Christopher felt no satisfaction in gazing at them. He sank onto the couch, mind whirling with questions. How had Layla died? Why had she never told him about Rosie until it was too late? And what precisely did she expect him to do now? He was good at making deals and forging alliances, but comforting a child and offering her a future he'd never imagined. This felt like stepping into unknown territory. Yet as the night deepened, a quiet resolve grew within him. One truth had become clear the moment Rosie said, "I came here because she told me you might help." Layla had believed in him when it mattered most. Maybe, after all his years pursuing financial triumph, it was time he put that success to use in a far more personal way. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, lending the living area a gentle glow that reflected off sleek marble floors. Christopher woke earlier than usual, unsettled by the presence of someone else under his roof. He couldn't recall the last time he'd felt such personal responsibility for another human being. As he slipped into the hallway, he wondered whether Rosie was still asleep. The door to her room was slightly ajar, revealing the quiet shape of her small form curled beneath the blankets. He hovered there, struck by how vulnerable she looked. For a moment he considered letting her rest, but he remembered the anxious way she'd clutched her backpack the night before. He knocked lightly on the doorframe. Rosie stirred, eyes fluttering open with a start, as though she'd been afraid to sleep too deeply. She sat up, blinking away remnants of exhaustion. Cautiously, she edged herself off the bed and rubbed her eyes. She still wore the same rumpled dress from yesterday. Christopher realized she had no change of clothes. It was such a simple, obvious thing, yet it pointed to how much she lacked. He cleared his throat to keep his voice gentle. "I ordered some breakfast," he said. "It should be here soon. Do you want to come out and eat?" Rosie nodded, barely meeting his gaze. Barely. They walked to the dining table, and a few minutes later a uniformed attendant arrived with trays, scrambled eggs, fruit, and toast, along with a pot of coffee for Christopher. He thanked the attendant quietly, dismissing the man so that Rosie wouldn't feel on display. Sitting across from her, Christopher tried to think of a way to ease her tension. "How did you sleep?" he asked, pushing a glass of orange juice toward her. She took it, swirling the contents before sipping. "It's the nicest bed I've ever slept in," she said, voice almost inaudible. "Thank you." There was no excitement, no childish wonder, just a polite gratitude that made Christopher's chest tighten. She was too young to be dealing with these burdens. He remembered how carefree children typically seemed, yet Rosie appeared haunted. He swallowed his coffee, glancing at her small hands as she carefully sliced an egg with her fork. "Rosie," he said gently, "we need to figure out a plan for you. I don't know everything that happened to your mother, and I'm sure it's difficult for you to talk about. But I think we should try to learn more so we can figure out the best way forward." Her eyes remained downcast. Mom was sick. A tremor wove through her words. "I knew it was bad, but she tried to hide it. When she got worse, she told me to ask for you." Her voice caught on the final syllable, and she pressed her lips together as though she feared crying in front of him. Christopher reached across the table, resting his hand near hers. He didn't touch her directly, worried that any sudden gesture might scare her away. "I'm so sorry," he said. It felt inadequate to say anything else. His mind raced with regrets. He could have helped Layla if only he'd known. Then again, how could he have known? She cut ties years ago. They finished breakfast in tense quiet. Once Rosie had eaten what she could, Christopher took her plate and set it aside. "I want to make a few phone calls," he explained. "I have some people who can help gather information. If that's okay with you?" She nodded dully, as though she wasn't certain what else to do. Christopher led her into the living area, offering her the remote to the television. "You can watch something, or there are some books on the shelf if you like reading." She shrugged, flipping through channels in a distracted way, eventually landing on a children's show. Stepping out of the room to give her some privacy, Christopher pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang once before a brisk professional voice answered. "Ms. Green speaking." "Natalie," Christopher began. "I need your help." Natalie Green was his longtime personal assistant and occasional miracle worker. She was adept at handling emergencies, though nothing quite like a sudden arrival of a grieving child. He summarized the situation in guarded terms, intentionally leaving out the more personal details. "I need information on Layla Turner's passing," he said. "Hospital records, any relatives who might still be out there, anything relevant. Also, see if there's a legal arrangement about custody for her daughter Rosie. Get everything." He could practically hear the gears turning in Natalie's head. "Understood," she replied swiftly. "I'll start making calls. Anything else?" He hesitated. "Yes. I want you to get some clothes for Rosie. She has nothing. You know her approximate size from what I've told you." "Yes, sir," Natalie said, and then paused. "Christopher, are you all right? This is quite unexpected." He exhaled. "I'm managing. Just get me what I need, please." He disconnected, wondering how to navigate the days to come. When he returned to the living room, Rosie was sitting stock still, the television playing some cartoon about talking animals in the background. She stared blankly, not seeming to absorb any of the show's cheerful chaos. She glanced at him with uncertainty. "Do you think I'll stay in another hotel after this one?" she asked softly, as though the question itself was precarious. Christopher's heart twisted. "You're welcome to stay here with me for now," he said, doing his best to project calm reassurance. "I have plenty of room. We'll find a solution that works best for you. But for the moment, you don't have to worry about going somewhere else." Rosie gave a tiny nod, eyes drifting back to the television. She seemed relieved, yet Christopher sensed the flicker of fear hadn't fully left her. It probably wouldn't fade until she felt stable. He realized his own life was about to change in a way he hadn't foreseen. Staying in a hotel was a short-term fix anyway. He owned a penthouse in the city, but it was no place for a child. It barely felt like a home for him, let alone for anyone else. Yet the alternative was sending her somewhere unknown, and that thought made him uneasy. Late that afternoon, a knock sounded at the penthouse door. Thinking it might be the hotel staff, Christopher rose to answer. Instead, he found Natalie Green standing there, arms laden with shopping bags. She was a petite woman in her 30s with a keen gaze and no shortage of composure. "I brought some essentials," she announced quietly, stepping into the suite. "Clothes, toiletries. I also have some preliminary information about Layla's final months." Rosie peeked out from behind the sofa, eyes darting curiously toward this new arrival. Natalie gave her a warm smile. "Hi, Rosie. I'm Natalie. I work with Christopher." She gestured to the bags. "I brought you some outfits. Hope they fit okay." Rosie nodded shyly, inching forward. "Thank you, Miss Natalie." She accepted one of the bags and rummaged through it, pulling out a pair of jeans and a soft sweater. For the first time, Christopher noticed a small flicker of interest in her eyes. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. Natalie caught Christopher's eye, then tilted her head, indicating she had news. He guided her to a corner of the living room, out of Rosie's earshot. "What did you find out?" he asked quietly. Layla Turner was indeed battling an illness. Cancer, to be precise, Natalie murmured, keeping her voice low. She was in and out of the hospital the past few months, but it seems she spent most of her final days at home. There was no official next of kin, no formal arrangement for Rosie in any will or testament. In fact, Ms. Turner had canceled her old lease and was living in a smaller apartment. It looks like she was behind on payments for medical bills. She might have tried to keep Rosie away from seeing the worst of it. Christopher's jaw tightened. Guilt churned in his stomach. Layla had been suffering, and he'd been blissfully ignorant in his corporate bubble. "Did you find anything else? Any mention of me?" Natalie shook her head. "No, it seems she kept your name off any paperwork, possibly to protect you or to avoid attention. But Rosie's neighbor, an older woman, was the one who briefly took the child in after Layla passed. That neighbor left for personal reasons, and the rest is what you already know." Christopher glanced at Rosie, who was now carefully folding the jeans from one of the bags. He lowered his voice further. "Natalie, I don't know what to do about all this. I can't just hand her over to some random foster care system. She's only here because Layla believed I could handle it." Natalie studied him. "There are official paths, of course. Child Protective Services, guardianship applications, but from what I can see, you might consider taking temporary custody until something more permanent is decided. That would require talking to an attorney, but given your resources, it wouldn't be complicated." She paused, watching Christopher's face for a reaction. "Unless you're sure you want to find another relative or caretaker." He let out a slow breath. "I want her to feel safe," he managed. "If Layla believed I was the only one she could trust, I owe it to her and to Rosie to be here, even if I have no idea what that looks like." Natalie nodded, her gaze flickering with something like approval. "I'll make discreet inquiries. In the meantime, you'll want to handle your day-to-day schedule around Rosie's needs." Christopher frowned. "That's another thing. I travel constantly. I'm supposed to be in Los Angeles next week for the contract signing, then overseas for a merger negotiation. Rosie can't just... she's grieving. She needs stability." "You may have to adjust your schedule," Natalie replied simply, "or consider bringing her with you if possible, but that might be too hectic." He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. He was a man who thrived on control. Now, for the first time, he felt as though life's demands were no longer solely about profits and strategic moves. This was raw human responsibility, unpredictable and urgent. Natalie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You can do this. If you need me to coordinate flights, reservations, or set up some kind of caretaker to travel with you, I will. But in my experience, kids need a consistent place to call home, even if that home is just an apartment with one caring adult." He gave a slight nod, an unspoken gratitude passing between them. After she left, Christopher rejoined Rosie, who was now dressed in the new jeans and sweater. The clothes were a bit loose, but they suited her better than the worn sundress she'd arrived in. "That's a nice outfit," Christopher offered. She glanced down and mumbled, "Thanks, it's really comfy." He hesitated, noticing how the conversation stalled quickly, overshadowed by the weight of everything unspoken. "How about we take a walk?" he suggested. "There's a small park nearby with a little garden. We could get some fresh air." Rosie shrugged. "All right." They left the opulence of the penthouse suite, slipping through the hotel's private exit to avoid the crowded lobby. Outside, a crisp breeze carried the scent of fall leaves. Rosie looked around, her eyes flicking toward the sidewalks filled with people hurrying about their business. He guided her to a quieter street, then down a cobblestone path that opened onto a modest green space. A fountain at the center burbled softly, and only a few passers-by sat on benches or strolled along the perimeter. They walked in silence. Christopher wondered how to fill the quiet, but words felt clumsy. Eventually, Rosie pointed to a cluster of small purple flowers near the fountain. "Mom liked those," she said. "She called them periwinkles." Christopher swallowed, following her gaze to the delicate blooms. "I didn't know that. She never mentioned them to me." "She liked a lot of things," Rosie murmured. I wish she'd told me more about you. All she said was you used to be important to her and that you'd help me someday if she couldn't." He closed his eyes briefly, grappling with his swirling emotions. "I wish she'd told me a lot of things too." He couldn't rid himself of the thought that Layla might have found a way to contact him if she'd truly believed it would help. Then again, pride and fear can be powerful barriers. Perhaps she didn't want him to see her suffering. Or maybe she was uncertain if he'd care enough to step in. Rosie toed the edge of the fountain, water reflecting shadows across her legs. "Do you think she's watching us right now, like from heaven?" He wasn't sure what he believed in that regard, but the question tugged at his heart. "Maybe she is, Rosie," he said softly, "and maybe she's glad we're here together." They lingered in the park for a while, letting the city's hum fade into the background. A gentle wind stirred the leaves overhead. Once or twice, Christopher caught Rosie looking at him, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in her eyes, as though evaluating whether he'd truly stick around. Part of him wanted to promise he'd never let her down, but how could he say that with certainty when he'd always let ambition guide his choices? Returning to the hotel, Christopher found he was reluctant to face the penthouse's sterile opulence. As they rode the elevator upward, he realized maybe it was time to bring Rosie somewhere else, somewhere not so transitory. He had that empty penthouse in the city, yes, but it wasn't child-friendly. Then again, if he was serious about taking responsibility, that place could be made into a home. They walked into the suite, and Rosie sank onto the sofa as though the day's revelations pressed her downward. Christopher sat beside her, leaving a respectful space. "Rosie," he began, "I know you miss your mom, and I'm not trying to replace her, but while you're with me, I want you to feel safe. That means not living out of a hotel indefinitely. Would you be okay moving into an apartment, my real home, for a while?" She fiddled with her sleeve. "Okay. Will I have my own room?" The question broke his heart a little, reminding him how uncertain her life must have been if she had to ask. "Yes," he promised. "We can set it up however you like." Her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. "Then, I'd like that." He offered a small smile. "All right. I'll make the arrangements." With that, Christopher turned on a lamp, noticing dusk settling over the skyline through the windows. A heavy sense of purpose filled him. Tomorrow he'd take Rosie to the penthouse that had stood empty for far too long. He'd call in designers if needed, or simply buy anything that might make her comfortable. It would be the first step toward something he never thought he'd have in his life, real responsibility for someone else's well-being. As Rosie's eyes fluttered with weariness, Christopher stood. "Let's get some dinner, then call it an early night. Tomorrow we'll be busy." In truth, he had no idea just how complicated the next days and weeks would become. But for once, he had something more meaningful than a business deal driving him forward. He had a promise to keep, for Layla, and for the silent hope in Rosie's eyes. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Early the next morning, Christopher found himself pacing the marble foyer of the Rosenthal Hotel's penthouse, mind brimming with details he needed to manage. He had made all the necessary calls the night before, spoken with his legal advisor about the logistics of taking Rosie in, arranged a car to transport them to his primary residence, and even contacted an old acquaintance in child psychology for advice on how to ease her transition. The efficiency of his planning felt almost like orchestrating a new business acquisition, yet beneath that cool precision he sensed the trembling thread of responsibility that had taken root in his heart. Rosie emerged from the bedroom just as he was zipping up his suitcase. She wore the same jeans and sweater as the day before, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail with a new elastic band Natalie had provided. Though still subdued, she seemed a touch more rested. She eyed Christopher's suitcase warily, like it might be a harbinger of yet another abrupt change. "We're checking out today," he explained gently, setting the case upright. "I've got a place not too far from here. It'll be much more comfortable than this hotel, and we can stay for as long as you need." Rosie nodded without comment. Christopher could only guess at her swirling thoughts. He reminded himself she was still processing a tremendous loss. They left the penthouse suite and took the elevator down in silence, stepping across the lobby's polished floors to the waiting town car. The driver, a reserved man in a neat black suit, moved to help with their bags. Rosie climbed into the back seat first, sliding over to make room for Christopher. As they drove, Christopher studied her from the corner of his eye. Sometimes she gazed out the window, taking in Manhattan's hustle without any visible excitement. Other times, she simply stared at her shoes as if the city's grandeur had lost all power to distract her from the grief she carried. He felt that tug of guilt again, the unspoken wish that he'd known about her and Layla sooner, that maybe he could have helped before things reached this dire stage. When they pulled up to Christopher's main penthouse building, Rosie's eyes flicked over the elegant awning and the doorman in a trim uniform. He led her inside, nodding to security as they boarded a private elevator to the top floor. The penthouse doors opened onto a sleek, minimalist living space with pristine white walls and soaring windows. Rosie stepped in, backpack clutched close, as though she weren't sure she belonged. "Welcome to my home," Christopher said, voice echoing slightly in the open layout. "It's not very cozy, I know, but we'll make it work." He gestured toward a hallway on the left. "There are 2 bedrooms down here. I'll show you yours." They passed through a polished corridor, the silence broken only by their footsteps. Rosie's new room was large, if plain. Light from the tall windows illuminated cream-colored walls, and a queen-size bed stood against one side, neatly made with soft gray bedding. There was a small desk, an empty bookshelf, and a closet with sliding doors. Rosie hesitated on the threshold, fingers tight around her backpack strap. "You can arrange things however you like," Christopher said, trying to sound encouraging. "If we need shelves, posters, anything to make it feel more like your space, let me know." Rosie nodded. She rested her backpack on the bed, looking around with solemn eyes. "Thank you, it's really nice." Christopher stepped back, giving her room to settle in. But when he saw her standing there, shoulders tense, he couldn't help but add softly, "You don't need to worry about me sending you away. I want you to be comfortable here." She mustered a slight smile, more of a polite acknowledgement than genuine relief, yet it was enough to nudge his own heart. Leaving her to explore, he returned to the living area where Natalie was already waiting. She stood by the windows, tapping something into her phone. The moment she spotted Christopher, she ended her call. "Everything's set," she reported. "I had a few more pieces of clothing delivered. Also, I spoke with a child therapist, Dr. Addison, who said she'd be happy to see Rosie if you want to schedule an appointment." He exhaled, appreciating Natalie's thoroughness. "Thank you. That might be good. Rosie hasn't really opened up much about what happened to her mother. I don't want to push her, but she needs support." Natalie nodded. "I can arrange a session this week if you like. On top of that, you'll need to handle legal details soon, formal guardianship, or at least a temporary arrangement. I'd suggest we move quickly to avoid any complications if someone else comes forward." He couldn't imagine who might try to claim Rosie, but the world was full of twists. "I'll talk to my attorney," Christopher said. "For now, I think it's best she just settles in and feels secure." A gentle knock interrupted them. Rosie stood in the corridor, glancing between Christopher and Natalie. "I just wanted to ask where the bathroom is." "Oh, of course," Christopher replied, leading her to a door near her bedroom. "I should give you the full tour later. This place is bigger than it looks." After Rosie slipped inside, Natalie lowered her voice. "She's going to need normalcy, routine, even if it's simple. Maybe some personal touches. A lamp she likes, a rug, something that says it's her room." He winced at how barren the penthouse felt. When he'd decorated, he'd chosen modern lines and neutral tones. It was a statement of luxury, not warmth. "I'll go shopping once she settles down. Get everything we need." Natalie left soon after, giving Christopher a meaningful look that reminded him he was treading unfamiliar territory. Alone again, he contemplated his next steps. He needed to rearrange his work schedule, and he still felt uneasy about the upcoming flight to Los Angeles. Rosie didn't have any official caretaker but him now. How could he vanish on a business trip and leave her alone in a massive penthouse? A live-in nanny might be a temporary fix, but the thought left him uneasy. She needed stability, not a rotation of strangers. Later that afternoon, he found Rosie leafing through the small stack of books Natalie had brought. She was perched on the edge of the living room sofa, glancing now and then at the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly, stepping into view. She nodded, though her expression was clouded. "Yes. I was just thinking about how much Mom liked books. She read a lot when she could. She used to say that if she ever got enough money, she'd open a little bookstore and work there once I was old enough." He sat down, leaving a space between them. "That sounds like something Layla would dream up. She was passionate about words and stories. I never told you this, but when I first met her, she was interviewing me for a finance magazine. She asked the toughest questions I'd heard in ages, and I remember thinking she was the only journalist who actually cared about more than a flashy headline." Rosie managed a faint, wistful smile. "She did care," she said. "She cared a lot about people who needed help." Christopher felt the sting of regret again. She was always a force of nature. I'm sorry, Rosie, that I wasn't there for her at the end." "She never blamed you," Rosie murmured, flipping a page in the book. It all happened so fast. I think she wanted to protect me from seeing how bad it was." He laid a hand on the sofa cushion, fighting the impulse to fix things with money or connections. Grief wasn't something he could sign off on and solve. In that moment, more than ever, he realized how ill-equipped he was. "If you ever want to talk," he said gently, "I'll listen." She nodded, pressing her lips together. For several seconds, neither spoke. The hush of the penthouse pressed in on them, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic from below. Then Rosie rubbed her eyes, voice quavering. "I miss her so much." Christopher swallowed hard. Without thinking, he moved closer and placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. Her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall, but she didn't pull away. "I know," he whispered. "It's okay to miss her." And so they sat there. Two people who had lost someone irreplaceable, one clinging to old regrets and the other to new sorrows. Eventually, Rosie sniffled and wiped her face on her sleeve. She didn't speak again, so Christopher stood and discreetly fetched a box of tissues. When she finally let a tear slip, she pressed the tissue to her cheek, looking small and weighed down by more pain than any child should carry. As twilight approached, Christopher realized they hadn't left the penthouse all day. He had groceries delivered, not wanting to drag Rosie through a busy supermarket when she was already fragile. Over a simple dinner of pasta and salad, she ate quietly, her appetite lacking. But she thanked him afterward. When they finished, he walked her back to her room. Pausing in the doorway, he noticed how empty the space seemed. "We can get you some decorations," he offered. "Posters, books, maybe a rug or two, anything you want." She nodded, shuffling her feet. That might be nice. He resisted the urge to say more, sensing she was close to her emotional limit. With a soft good night, he left her to unwind. Once alone, he sank into the living room's armchair, mind thrumming with unresolved questions. He thought about Layla's fierce spirit. Could she have left some final message or letter explaining her wishes for Rosie's future? Perhaps she'd tried but ran out of time. Feeling restless, he rummaged through his phone, combing old contacts to see if anyone from Layla's circle might offer insights. But it had been so many years that he didn't recognize half the numbers, and the ones he did recall were purely professional leads. Eventually, he set his phone down in frustration. His typical strategy, research, phone calls, problem solved, wouldn't entirely mend Rosie's grief. Close to midnight, he checked on Rosie one more time. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow from the hallway light spilling through the door crack. She was curled under the covers, breathing steadily. Her backpack lay at the bed's foot, half unzipped, revealing a well-worn stuffed rabbit. He realized she hadn't pulled it out in front of him, as though reluctant to show any childish vulnerability. The sight made his heart ache. He slipped back into his own room, an austere space with blackout curtains and minimalist decor. Stripping off his suit jacket, he loosened his tie and thought about all the changes this new responsibility would require. Canceling or postponing business trips, finding her a school if she stayed long-term, and ensuring she got the support she needed. On some level, the magnitude of it all frightened him. He was used to controlling mergers and building wealth, not raising a child. And yet a small voice in his mind reminded him that Rosie had no one else. He fell into a fitful sleep, waking sporadically from half-formed dreams of Layla's face. At dawn, he rose to a faint sense of resolve, telling himself that if he could command fortunes, he could handle this too. When he checked on Rosie, he found her sitting at the desk, drawing on a piece of paper with pens Natalie had included in the shopping bags. She glanced up, blinking as though expecting scolding. "That looks nice," he commented, stepping closer. It was a sketch of a bookstore front, a cozy facade with shelves near the entrance and tiny customers browsing. She set the pen down. "I just wanted to remember Mom's idea about opening a bookstore. I can't really draw, but it's lovely," he said. "That store looks inviting." A flash of pride, faint but genuine, crossed her face. "Thanks." He took a careful seat on the edge of her bed. "I have some things to sort out today, but I thought tomorrow we could go out together. Maybe pick out some stuff for your room?" She exhaled, hugging her arms around herself. "Sure." He watched her quietly. Even in the smallest gestures, a flicker of eye contact, a tiny word of acceptance, he saw signs that she might one day trust him enough to let down her guard. It wouldn't be immediate, but it was a start. In the meantime, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe and build a routine that made her feel less adrift. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. By the following afternoon, Christopher's penthouse felt slightly less cavernous. Rosie's presence, though quiet, infused the space with a subtle hint of everyday life. She spent the morning reading one of the books Natalie had brought, occasionally looking up as if to double-check she was really here. Christopher, meanwhile, was immersed in phone calls with his legal team, ensuring he had a lawful framework to care for Rosie as long as she needed him. Even from across the living area, Rosie could hear the undercurrent of tension in those conversations. She noticed how Christopher's tone changed when he talked about her situation. Words like temporary custody and best interests peppered his speech, terms that floated through the air and made her stomach clench. She didn't fully grasp the legalities, but the idea of her future being discussed by strangers unsettled her more than she could articulate. Late in the morning, Christopher ended his call and set his phone aside. His shoulders were rigid from the strain of trying to blend his high-pressure work with this new personal reality. Spotting Rosie watching him, he attempted a smile. "Everything's moving forward," he said gently. "I'm making sure no one can force you into someplace you don't want to be." Rosie nodded, her gaze wandering back to her book. She wished she knew how to express her gratitude without feeling awkward. Before her mother passed, life had been precarious. Worries about rent, about food, about the future. Yet Layla's love had been unwavering. Now Rosie found herself living in a stranger's penthouse, watching that stranger reorganize his entire life for her. It was both comforting and profoundly frightening. So much change in so little time made her wonder if this too could vanish. After lunch, Christopher suggested they venture out to pick up some items for Rosie's room. She hesitated, hugging the book against her chest, but he insisted. "You told me you'd like some posters," he reminded her, "and maybe a lamp or rug. Let's make your space more personal." So they went downstairs to the waiting car. The crisp air outside carried a hint of autumn, leaves swirling across the sidewalks. Rosie pressed her face against the window as they drove, glimpsing storefronts filled with Halloween decorations. She felt a pang of memory. Her mother used to get so excited about holidays. They would carve pumpkins and watch scary movies, giggling when the jump scares were too silly. Now the season's festivities seemed oddly distant. They arrived at a home decor store geared toward families with bright signs advertising children's furniture and accessories. Rosie followed Christopher down the aisles, feeling uncertain about all the choices. Plush rugs in every color, lamps shaped like animals, posters of dreamy landscapes or pop music idols. Eventually, a pastel rug with tiny stars caught her eye. "Do you like that?" Christopher asked. He sounded more hopeful than she expected, like he truly wanted her to say yes if it would make her happy. She nodded. "It's pretty, and I like stars." He placed it in their cart. Next, they stopped by the wall art section, scanning various posters. Rosie lingered near a row of book-themed prints. One depicted a cozy little shop with a sign reading, "Books and Dreams." It reminded her of the bookstore she'd sketched that morning, and her heart fluttered. When Christopher saw her pause, he took the poster off the rack without waiting for her to ask. "I think this will look nice," he said. "You can hang it above your desk." Rosie managed a small smile. "Thank you." As they moved to the checkout, Christopher caught her eyeing a display of plush pillows shaped like adorable animals. She didn't say anything, but she stopped for a moment, touching a soft bunny pillow. He noticed. "We can get that too if you want," he offered gently. She set it down, cheeks warming. "I'm okay." He paused, sensing her reluctance. Maybe she felt she didn't deserve more, or perhaps she feared being a burden. "Rosie, it's all right if there's something you like. You don't have to pretend you're fine without it." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Finally, she lifted the bunny pillow into the cart. "Okay," she whispered. "It's cute." An hour later, they returned to the penthouse, arms full of purchases. With Christopher's help, Rosie spread out the rug near her bed, then found a suitable spot on the wall for the poster. She seemed more focused than he'd ever seen her, measuring angles, smoothing out edges, making sure the corners lined up just right. When the final piece was in place, she stepped back and regarded her handiwork with a quiet sort of pride. Her new lamp was a simple design with a warm yellow glow, and they set it up on the nightstand. Christopher plugged it in, and Rosie flipped the switch, blinking as the gentle light illuminated her face. In that moment, her eyes shone with something close to comfort. "It feels less empty now," she said finally, looking at the rug beneath her feet. The star pattern looked like an expanse of night sky captured in soft fabric. "I'm glad," Christopher replied. He took a seat on the edge of her bed, trying to read her expression. You can tell me if there's anything else you need. Clothes, toys, books, whatever helps. A hint of sadness flickered across her features. Thanks, she said, voice subdued. Then she grew quiet. After a moment, she asked, Did you and my mom ever talk about the future? Her question caught him off guard. Once or twice, he admitted. But we were both busy. I was focusing on my career, she was traveling for interviews. We never settled in one place for long. Rosie toyed with the lamp switch. Mom said she loved traveling, but sometimes she just wanted to plant roots somewhere. She didn't add that Layla had never found the stability she yearned for, cut short by her illness. A somber hush settled in the room, and Christopher realized anew that grief lingered like a veil over every conversation. He wanted to offer Rosie more comfort, but he feared empty words. So he gently excused himself, leaving her to arrange her new belongings. He found himself in the living room gazing out at the skyscrapers. His mind roved restlessly. Layla was no longer here, and Rosie's life had been turned upside down. Perhaps it was naive to think he could patch that hole, but he wanted to try. Could he dare be more than just a short-term guardian? The notion raised complicated feelings. He'd never envisioned raising a child. Yet as the days passed, the idea of letting her go somewhere else felt increasingly wrong. That evening, they ate dinner together at the small dining table. Christopher cooked a simple meal, pasta again, but this time with grilled chicken and vegetables. Rosie ate with a bit more appetite, though she still cast anxious glances around. Afterward, he asked if she'd like to watch a movie. Her eyes lit with cautious interest, and she nodded. In the living area, they searched through streaming options until Rosie settled on an animated film about a fox and a cat traveling the countryside. She curled into the corner of the couch, hugging a throw pillow. About halfway through, Christopher realized she was quietly crying, tears glinting on her cheeks, when the story's orphaned cat spoke about missing her mother. Uncertain, he paused the movie. Rosie scrubbed at her tears, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she murmured, voice shaky. It made me think of Mom." Gently, Christopher reached over to offer her a tissue. "Don't apologize," he said. "It's okay to feel sad. Do you want to stop the movie?" She sniffled, shook her head. "No, it's a good story. I wish things were different." He had no response that felt adequate. Instead, he sat back, unpausing the film. A quiet understanding formed between them, an unspoken permission for her to grieve openly without shame. By the time the credits rolled, the tears on her face had dried, leaving only traces of redness around her eyes. She whispered thank you when Christopher helped her to her feet. Then she disappeared into her room, leaving him alone with the flicker of the television screen. Later, he retired to his own room with exhaustion tugging at him. As he loosened his tie, a habit he hadn't quite shaken even at home, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face gazing back at him looked older than he remembered, lines of worry etched at his brow. This was no hostile business environment, but the stakes felt higher than any negotiation he'd ever navigated. If he failed here, it wasn't money he stood to lose. It was a vulnerable child's trust and emotional well-being. In the darkest hours of the night, Christopher found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. To his surprise, he unearthed a single snapshot he'd forgotten about, a blurred shot of Layla at some rooftop bar event laughing at something off-camera. Her hair caught the city lights, framing a radiant grin. He lingered on that image, a bittersweet ache filling his chest. He wished he could speak to her now, to ask how she managed to stay strong for Rosie, to find out why she never reached out for his help when her health declined. Maybe she'd feared he would resent the responsibility. Or maybe she had believed she could handle it alone. Too many questions hovered without answers. The next day began with a sense of cautious normalcy. Christopher cooked breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, along with a plate of sliced fruit. Rosie appeared in the kitchen, hair hastily brushed, wearing a new sweater. She murmured a hello, taking a seat at the small table. He noticed a faint bruise on her wrist and felt alarm race through him before recalling she'd mentioned bumping into a door last week. His protective instincts flared, surprising him with their intensity. After breakfast, Rosie asked if she could draw again. Christopher nodded, grateful she'd found an outlet for her feelings. While she sketched, he opened his laptop at the kitchen counter. He had a flurry of emails to address, deals on hold, and a pressing invitation to a major finance conference in Singapore. Normally, he would have jumped at the chance, flying overseas, securing new alliances. Now, the thought of leaving Rosie behind or dragging her into that hectic schedule made him hesitate. He typed a message to his staff, instructing them to delegate or postpone. A part of him winced at the potential cost, but another part felt oddly at peace. Sometimes the things that matter most aren't measured by profit margins. Shortly after, the door intercom buzzed. Christopher glanced at the screen to see Natalie standing outside, carrying a slim binder under her arm. He let her in, and she greeted Rosie with a gentle smile before joining Christopher in the kitchen. "I've compiled everything," she said, tapping the binder. "Temporary guardianship, plus the earliest appointment with a family court judge if you want something more formal. Also, Dr. Addison can fit Rosie in on Thursday for a preliminary therapy session." Christopher nodded, taking the binder. "I appreciate it. Any news about Layla's personal effects?" Natalie shook her head. "Not much left, I'm afraid. Just a few boxes stored in a friend's basement, according to the neighbor. I've asked for the address so we can retrieve them. Rosie might want something that belonged to her mother." He glanced over at the living area where Rosie was preoccupied with her artwork. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Let's go through that soon. It might help her find some closure." Natalie placed a hand lightly on Christopher's arm. "You're doing the right thing. She's lucky she has you looking out for her." Then, noticing Rosie's gaze flick in their direction, Natalie gave a final nod and stepped away to say goodbye to the girl. Christopher found himself standing at a personal crossroads he'd never anticipated. He had all the resources in the world to ensure Rosie's physical comfort, but the emotional journey was a path they'd have to walk together, step by step. He closed the binder and joined Rosie in the living room, kneeling beside her as she colored in the outlines of her newest sketch. She looked up, crayons in hand. "What are you working on?" he asked, leaning closer to see. "A picture of a fox and a cat," she said quietly, referencing last night's movie. They became best friends and found a home at the end. Her voice wobbled on the word home, a reminder that she'd lost hers. He offered a small, reassuring smile. "That's a nice idea," he said. "Maybe that's what we'll be, like a fox and a cat, two unlikely friends figuring out where they belong." Rosie gazed at him, her dark eyes uncertain but not without hope. "I'd like that," she whispered, returning to her drawing. In that gentle moment, Christopher felt an unexpected warmth bloom in his chest. He still had doubts about his capability, about balancing work and care, about whether Rosie would ever truly heal from the loss of her mother. But for now, he was here, and she was reaching out. Perhaps that was enough to keep going. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Christopher woke early the next day, mind churning with half-formed plans. It was Thursday, Rosie's first scheduled therapy session with Dr. Addison. He'd coordinated everything through Natalie, who had given him the address of a warm, family-oriented practice on the Upper West Side. From the living room window, The city looked cloaked in gentle morning light, skyscrapers stretching toward a pale sky. He hoped this might be a good step for Rosie, though he felt a pang of nerves at the idea of leaving her in a stranger's office. Leaning against the counter, he sipped a cup of black coffee and reminded himself that professional help was exactly what she needed. Healing required time and guidance, and he couldn't do it alone. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the same star-patterned rugs colors and a simple t-shirt and jeans. Her eyes flicked uncertainly from Christopher's mug to the clock on the wall. She seemed calmer since settling into her new room, though she still carried that undercurrent of watchfulness. When he explained that they'd be heading to Dr. Addison's office soon, she nodded with a mixture of reluctance and acceptance. She asked no questions, simply retrieved a slice of toast from the counter and chewed in silence. He sensed she was apprehensive about recounting her grief to a stranger, but he also suspected there was a part of her that wanted an outlet for all those bottled-up feelings. The drive across town was subdued. Traffic crawled past newsstands and coffee shops just beginning their morning rush. Rosie stared out the window, fiddling with a small keychain she'd clipped to her backpack, the shape of a tiny book, a gift from Natalie. Christopher allowed the hum of the car engine to fill the silence, wishing he had the right words to soothe her nerves. He never excelled at emotional conversations, so he simply rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they pulled up to the office building. Dr. Addison's practice was housed in a converted brownstone, its stone steps framed by neat planters of bright chrysanthemums. Inside, the waiting area exuded warmth. Pastel walls, comfortable chairs, a shelf stocked with children's books and plush toys. Rosie perched on the edge of a chair, studying the stuffed animals lined along a window seat. Eventually, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes emerged, introducing herself as Dr. Addison. She led Rosie into a cozy room filled with art supplies and inviting cushions. Christopher remained in the hallway, heart tight as the door clicked shut. He'd never felt so powerless, unable to peer into the conversation, forced to trust that someone else could guide Rosie through thoughts she might not yet be ready to speak. Time seemed to drag, the minutes stretching into nearly an hour. To distract himself, he flipped through some children's magazines on a side table, mostly scanning pictures of crafts and seasonal activities. He wondered how a typical father might handle such a scenario. Then he caught himself. He still couldn't fully claim that role. But in the hush of that waiting area, he recognized that every breath he held was for Rosie's sake. When the session ended, Dr. Addison emerged with Rosie by her side. Rosie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her posture hinted at a small measure of relief. The therapist offered Christopher a reassuring nod. "Rosie did very well," Dr. Addison said. "It'll take time for her to process everything, but she was brave enough to share some of her worries. We'll continue at her pace." Rosie stood close to Christopher, shoulders trembling slightly. He placed a gentle hand on her back. "Thank you," he said to the doctor, voice low. On the ride home, he noticed Rosie occasionally rubbing at her eyes, though she seemed calmer than before. They stopped at a bakery to pick up sandwiches for lunch, and she asked quietly if she could get a pastry. He smiled, buying her a chocolate croissant. An ordinary gesture, but it felt like a small, important victory to see her appetite for something sweet. Back at the penthouse, Rosie retreated to her room. Christopher was about to settle at his laptop for a video conference when the phone rang. It was Natalie, sounding more urgent than usual. "Christopher, I finally got in touch with that neighbor. She's found a few boxes of Layla's personal items. They're stored in a friend's basement. We have permission to pick them up whenever we're ready. I wanted to let you know right away." He thanked her, scheduling a pickup for the same afternoon. When he explained to Rosie that they'd found some of her mother's belongings, her eyes went wide. "I'd like to see them," she whispered. "There might be photos, or things she always kept." The basement was a cramped, musty space beneath a row house in Queens. The neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Viola, greeted Christopher and Rosie with a friendly but weary smile. "These were all that remained," she said, leading them to a corner stacked with 2 or 3 plastic boxes. "Layla asked me to hold on to them in case Rosie needed any memories. I'm sorry it took so long to find them." Rosie knelt, running her fingers along the lids. "Thank you," she managed, voice shaky. Christopher gently helped her pry one open. Inside lay an assortment of items: a few framed photographs, scribbled notes, old notebooks filled with Layla's handwriting, and some clothing folded haphazardly. One photograph caught Christopher's eye. In it, Layla stood at the edge of a park, holding a small toddler with curly hair, undoubtedly Rosie. The child was giggling while Layla smiled, looking healthier and happier. Rosie's throat hitched as she saw it, tears threatening to spill. Without speaking, she tucked the photo into her backpack. She also found a battered, spiral-bound notebook labeled Ideas, Books, Articles, which she hugged tight to her chest. They loaded the boxes into Christopher's car. Before leaving, Viola pressed a small envelope into Rosie's hand. "Layla told me if anything happened, I should give you this," she said quietly. "But well, it slipped my mind. I'm sorry, child." Rosie stared at the envelope with trembling fingers, then carefully tucked it away. She didn't open it on the ride home. Christopher glanced at her in the rearview mirror, aching to know what it contained, but unwilling to intrude. He sensed that this might be Layla's final message, something Rosie needed to face on her own terms. As soon as they returned, Rosie retreated to her bedroom with the envelope and the boxes. Christopher let her be, busying himself with stowing the rest of Layla's things in a spare closet. He handled them with reverence, each item a fragment of a life cut tragically short. Later, he knocked on Rosie's door gently. "You okay in there?" She opened the door, eyes red and nose sniffly, but she nodded. On her bed lay the open notebook, revealing Layla's scrawled sketches for potential articles along with half-finished short stories. Beside it was the empty envelope, a single sheet of paper resting on top. Clearly Layla's handwriting. Rosie placed a hand protectively over the paper as Christopher walked in. "It's a letter," she said in a hushed tone. "She wrote it to me." Christopher's heart squeezed. He moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "Do you want to talk about it?" Rosie inhaled shakily. She said she was sorry she couldn't give me the life she dreamed about, that she never wanted me to feel alone. And she told me I might find someone one day who could help me grow up safe. I think she meant you." Her voice quivered on that final sentence. Emotion welled in Christopher's chest, a sharp mixture of grief and gratitude. He recalled the last time he'd seen Layla in person. She'd been fierce, proud, refusing his help when he'd tried to finance one of her more ambitious projects. He'd taken it as a slight, walked away, never knowing she was pregnant, or at least raising Rosie so soon afterward. He gently sat at the edge of the bed, meeting Rosie's gaze. "I'll try my best to be what she wanted for you, I promise." Rosie nodded, tears glistening. She scooted closer, resting her head against his arm. It was the closest contact she'd initiated since arriving. Christopher felt a wave of tenderness as he placed his hand lightly atop her head, neither pushing nor pulling away. They sat like that, quiet but connected, for several moments. Eventually, Rosie closed the notebook and carefully folded the letter back into the envelope. "I want to keep these here in my room," she whispered. "That way it feels like she's not so far away." Christopher's throat felt tight. "Of course, they're yours." He stood and offered a small smile. "We'll figure this out together, okay?" She looked up at him with watery eyes. "Okay," she echoed. For the first time since she'd shown up in that hotel lobby, Christopher sensed a fragile trust forming, like the first green shoots in a long barren field. In the days that followed, Rosie's therapy sessions continued, each one unlocking more of her grief. Dr. Addison reported that while Rosie struggled to speak openly about the final weeks of Layla's life, she showed signs of emerging resilience. Christopher also noticed small changes at home. Rosie hung her new poster carefully, rearranged her desk, and pinned the photograph of her and Layla on the bulletin board. Late one afternoon, she came out of her bedroom, notebook in hand, to show Christopher a short paragraph she'd written, an idea for a story about a mother and daughter who run a traveling bookstore. He read it slowly, heart brimming with empathy. He told her it was beautiful, and she looked both proud and shy at once. On a practical level, Christopher pushed forward with guardianship proceedings. Lawyers filed paperwork to secure a formal arrangement, ensuring Rosie wouldn't be placed in foster care or claimed by distant relatives she'd never met. When he told Rosie about it, she simply nodded and said, "Thank you." He wondered if she understood the magnitude of his commitment. He also faced the question of what to do about her education. She'd attended public school sporadically in the past, but her enrollment had lapsed during Layla's final illness. Dr. Addison recommended waiting a little longer before sending her back into a classroom, to give her emotional wounds more time to heal. Christopher agreed. The last thing Rosie needed was another jarring upheaval. Meanwhile, the swirl of Christopher's own business concerns lingered at the edges. Each day, messages arrived from associates requesting meetings, pushing for deals. He delegated as much as possible, uncharacteristically content to let certain matters pass him by. Some nights he'd glance at his phone, see a dozen missed calls from board members, and shut it off. For now, Rosie was more important than any acquisition or conference. He found his priorities shifting in a way that both startled and steadied him. One evening, he found Rosie sitting in the living room, flipping through the battered spiral notebook. She looked up when he approached, a question in her eyes. "Do you think my mom would be proud that I'm living with you?" she asked quietly, voice quivering with doubt. He swallowed. "I think she'd be relieved," he said, choosing his words carefully. "She wanted you safe and cared for. I may not have all the answers, but I promise I won't give up on you." She studied his expression, then nodded. "Okay." Slipping a ribbon between the pages to mark her place, she set the notebook aside and motioned for him to sit. "Can we watch another movie tonight?" she asked, almost shyly, as if requesting a favor. Christopher's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Of course. Which one?" She shrugged. "Surprise me." And for the first time, there was a small, genuine spark in her gaze, like she was inching toward trust, letting him be part of her day-to-day life in ways that once seemed impossible. They settled in front of the television again, selecting a light-hearted adventure film about a group of oddball friends finding their path in the world. Midway through, Rosie absent-mindedly reached for Christopher's arm, curling up against him as a funny scene played out. He felt her tension melt just a bit, her body relaxing into his side. The simple gesture touched something deep within him, a fatherly protectiveness he had never realized he possessed. After the credits rolled, Rosie yawned. He walked her to her room, flicking on the soft lamp by her bed, noticing how the star-patterned rug and the cozy pillow gave the space a gentle warmth. She hesitated at the threshold, then turned to him. "Could you stay for a minute?" she asked. He nodded, stepping inside, uncertain of what she needed, but she just wanted him there, it seemed. She climbed onto the bed, leaning against the headboard while he lingered near the desk. For a few quiet moments, neither spoke, their shared presence enough to stave off the loneliness of night. Then she murmured good night, and he quietly slipped out, heart full of cautious hope. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Christopher found himself growing accustomed to gentle but persistent shifts in the penthouse routine. Rosie's presence, once a silent, uncertain shadow, had begun weaving into his daily life in a way that felt natural and strangely comforting. He saw it in the small changes: a new drawing taped to the fridge, the star-patterned rug in her bedroom that made the place feel less sterile, and even the faint sound of her voice at times when she spoke to him without the fearful edge that had once laced her tone. A week passed since her last therapy session, and Dr. Addison's ongoing updates remained cautiously optimistic. Rosie was still processing the trauma of losing her mother, grappling with how her world had upended, but the doctor believed she was stabilizing. Christopher took this as a good sign, though he never forgot that emotional healing could ebb and flow. On a bright Tuesday morning, Christopher decided it might help Rosie to get out more. He had noticed that beyond her occasional walks to the nearby park or the short trips to the store, she spent most of her time indoors, reading or sketching at her desk. Part of him worried she was slowly withdrawing again, afraid that venturing too far from this new bubble might bring more loss. So he gently suggested they visit a local library, knowing her fondness for books might open another door toward normalcy. Rosie agreed, face tinged with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. After breakfast, they caught a taxi across town, winding through Manhattan's busy avenues. The library itself was a large, stately building with columns out front and broad steps leading up to heavy wooden doors. Inside, the hush of countless pages and the subdued footfalls of readers provided a comforting backdrop. Rosie's eyes flicked around with interest as they passed shelves of novels, periodicals, and bright children's books. He guided her toward a quieter corner, where a children's reading nook displayed colorful chairs and stuffed animals. Though Rosie was older than the typical occupant of that space, Christopher thought the whimsical setting might help break the tension. She wandered over to the bookshelves, fingers trailing over the spines of novels and story collections. Every so often she glanced back at him, as if double-checking that he was still there, still consistent. Eventually she knelt to examine a hardcover about a young girl who aspired to be an explorer. Christopher noticed how her lips quirked into a faint smile. She clutched the book protectively, then straightened. "Could we maybe borrow this one?" she asked. He nodded. "Of course. You can pick as many as you'd like." She selected a couple more, mostly quiet tales filled with subtle illustrations. The librarian at the front desk smiled kindly when Rosie presented her choices. Christopher arranged for a new library card in Rosie's name, feeling a small surge of satisfaction at such an ordinary act. Normal, everyday life for a child, something she desperately needed. On their way out, Rosie paused by a bulletin board full of community flyers. She studied a poster advertising a children's writing workshop hosted at the library on Saturdays. Her expression lit with curiosity. "A writing workshop," she said softly. "You think I could go?" Christopher glanced at the details. It was aimed at kids roughly around Rosie's age and older, designed to encourage storytelling, journaling, and poetry. "I think you'd be perfect for it," he replied without hesitation. "If you want to try it, let's sign you up." She looked both excited and hesitant at once. "I've never really done something like that, but maybe it would be good." That spark of anticipation in her eyes was all Christopher needed to see. The idea of her engaging with other kids around a shared passion, words and stories, felt like a breakthrough. He made a mental note to contact the library staff and enroll her in the workshop as soon as possible. Returning to the penthouse, Rosie settled into the living room with her new library books. Christopher offered to make lunch, a quick grilled cheese and tomato soup that was simple but comforting. As they ate, she seemed eager to share the plots of the stories she'd picked. She told him about the explorer girl who discovered hidden treasures and overcame her fears. The bright glimmer in Rosie's gaze reminded Christopher of Layla's spirit, determined, imaginative, and unwilling to let adversity define her. By late afternoon, Christopher had retreated to his study to handle a video conference with one of his business partners. He left the door slightly open, aware that Rosie sometimes got uneasy if he vanished too long behind a closed door. The call revolved around an upcoming merger, one he might have once pursued with fervor. Now, his attention drifted. He found himself thinking about the next steps in Rosie's therapy, the writing workshop, and how to ensure that each part of her day felt safe and supportive. Once the call ended, he emerged to find Rosie sprawled on the couch, sketching a rough map on a sheet of paper. She'd labeled it Adventure Paths, with little icons that seemed to represent mountains, lakes, and hidden caves. He lowered himself onto an adjacent chair, intrigued. "Planning a journey?" he asked lightly. She pushed a stray hair behind her ear, looking up. "Just imagining a story," she admitted. "The library book about the explorer girl gave me ideas. I wanted to draw a map of where she might go next." He leaned in, glancing over the bold pencil lines. "That's really creative," he said. "Maybe you'll share it at the writing workshop." She fidgeted with the corner of the paper. "Maybe," she said quietly, but there was a flicker of excitement in her eyes. That evening, as they cleared away dinner plates, Christopher decided to share more about his own childhood. He'd noticed that Rosie rarely asked him personal questions. Perhaps she feared crossing a boundary or was uncertain of how much she could trust him. But he sensed she might like to know that even a successful adult had once been a child full of hopes and insecurities. He began with a simple recollection. "When I was about your age, I lived in a small town for a few years before my family moved to the city. We had this big tree in the backyard, massive branches that stretched way out. I used to climb it all the time, even though my mom said it was too high. She caught me once, perched near the top, and nearly fainted. But I loved the view from up there. It felt like anything was possible." Rosie listened intently. Her spoon paused in midair over her dessert. "You weren't scared of falling?" she asked, voice curious. He chuckled. "Terrified, actually. But I did it anyway because part of me believed that if I climbed high enough, I'd see something amazing. Sometimes that's what being a kid is like. You want to test your limits, see how far you can go." She took a thoughtful bite of her ice cream. "And then you moved to the city and became super rich," she said, with a hint of dry humor that startled him. He had to laugh at her bluntness. "Well, there were a few steps in between," he said lightly. "It wasn't a straight line from climbing trees to board meetings." A flicker of a smile crossed her face. "Still sounds cooler than me. I've only ever lived in tiny apartments with Mom, and we never stayed anywhere for long." He heard the note of wistful longing in her voice. "Well, you can stay here as long as you want," he said gently. "And maybe one day we'll find a safe climbing spot, if that's what you'd like." She merely shrugged, but her expression softened, as though the concept of a stable future didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Later, as they each headed to bed, Christopher felt a quiet sense of hope. Slow and steady, they were forging a bond that once seemed impossible. The next day brought a mild autumn rain pattering against the windows of the penthouse. Rosie spent most of the morning in her room reading. Christopher took a phone call from Natalie, who asked how things were progressing. "Rosie's doing better than when she arrived," he reported. "She's opening up little by little." Natalie sounded pleased. She updated him on the guardianship filing. Everything was in motion, no complications expected. With each passing conversation, the idea of making Rosie a permanent part of his life felt more natural, almost inevitable. He thought often of Layla's letter, how she had hinted that Christopher might be the one to ensure Rosie's future was bright. At first, that notion weighed on him like an unearned responsibility. Now it felt more like a promise he was determined to keep. That afternoon, the rain still drizzled down, turning the city into a haze of wet sidewalks and shimmering car headlights. Rosie wandered into the living room, notebook in hand. She wore a hoodie that swallowed her small frame. "Do you want to see what I wrote last night?" she asked, cheeks coloring faintly. "It's kind of short." Christopher set aside the financial spreadsheet he'd been half-heartedly reviewing. "I'd love to," he said. He'd learned quickly that Rosie shared her creative work only when she felt secure. Every glimpse he got into her thoughts was a precious sign of trust. She handed him the notebook, open to a page of neat, looping handwriting. The title read, "Nighttime Adventures," and the opening lines described a young girl who sneaked out after dark to chase falling stars, collecting them in a lantern. Each star had a secret inside. In the margins, little sketches illustrated how the protagonist carried a glimmering orb through moonlit streets. Christopher's throat tightened as he read. This was more than a simple story. It felt like Rosie's way of capturing hope in a realm where magic could still exist. "It's wonderful," he said, handing the notebook back gently. "You have a real gift for painting scenes in words. Will you read it at the workshop?" She chewed her lip. "Maybe. I'm not sure I'm ready to read it out loud, but I might let the teacher see it." "That's a start," he assured her. "You should be proud of yourself, Rosie." A faint blush touched her cheeks. "Thanks," she murmured. Then she tucked the notebook under her arm and settled beside him on the couch as if seeking comfort in his presence. Outside, the raindrops tapped a steady rhythm against the glass, but inside, Christopher felt the fragile warmth of connection. Night fell early under the clouds, and Rosie retreated to her room to write again. Christopher busied himself tidying the kitchen, marveling at how normal it felt to handle mundane tasks while caring for someone else. Not too long ago, he'd have outsourced every chore to service staff. Yet now, picking up after dinner was almost therapeutic, a small, tangible way to maintain stability. Around 9 o'clock, he noticed Rosie's door was still open a crack, soft lamplight spilling into the hall. He peeked inside and found her curled in bed, the open notebook on her lap, pencil still in hand. She gazed at him with heavy-lidded eyes, exhaustion evident in every feature. He smiled gently. "You should rest," he said. "You can finish that tomorrow." She nodded, stifling a yawn. "Good night," she mumbled. "Thanks for everything." "Good night, Rosie," he replied, voice low. "Sweet dreams." He slid the door mostly shut, leaving a sliver of light. It struck him how quickly they'd fallen into the rhythms of a household, small touches of routine and closeness. He could not erase the pain of Layla's absence, but each new day reminded him that maybe he could offer Rosie a life her mother would have wanted. In his own room, Christopher stood by the window, rain sliding down the glass in rivulets. He thought back to his earlier conversation with Natalie, how the guardianship process was nearly formalized. Soon, no one could question his right to protect Rosie or her right to stay. He imagined Layla looking on from some distant place, relieved that Rosie had found a safe harbor. For the first time, Christopher pictured what the future might hold a year down the line, or 5. The idea didn't frighten him as it once had. Instead, he saw glimpses of Rosie continuing to grow, maybe traveling with him occasionally if she desired. Perhaps they'd fill her room with more posters, maybe let her pick out furniture to suit her emerging tastes. He might learn how to navigate the emotional upheavals of adolescence, become the adult who showed up to parent-teacher meetings, signed field trip forms, and planned birthdays with balloons. Though he recognized the road would be far from simple, the vision stirred a gentle determination in his chest. As the rain continued outside, he remembered the old tree he'd climbed as a boy. Standing so high up, he had seen the horizon open wide and realized how small his worries seemed below. Now the perspective was different, but the sense of hope remained. That intangible, precious feeling gave him the courage to believe that he and Rosie could climb together, balancing fear with wonder, forging a family from the ashes of what they both had lost. The next morning dawned with a soft, pale light. Christopher woke to the subtle hum of the city below, his thoughts shifting at once to Rosie and the progress they'd made. He dressed quickly, slipping into a casual shirt and slacks instead of his usual tailored suit. He had no pressing meetings today, by choice. Over the past few weeks, he'd begun delegating major responsibilities to his senior staff, letting them manage the daily corporate grind. With Rosie under his roof, he found a different kind of work filling his schedule, scheduling therapy sessions, planning meals and outings, and learning to support a grieving child on her terms. He stepped into the hall and paused by Rosie's door. It was quiet within. Her therapy appointment wasn't until the afternoon, so he decided not to disturb her. He retreated to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and toasted a bagel. The bagel popped up just as he heard the gentle pad of footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Rosie, hair mussed from sleep, wearing a too large sweatshirt over her pajama pants. She rubbed her eyes and offered him a small smile. "Morning," she mumbled, voice husky with sleep. "Morning," he answered. "You hungry? I can make eggs or another bagel if you like." She stifled a yawn. "Bagel's fine. Cream cheese, please." He spread cream cheese onto a fresh bagel and set it in front of her, watching as she fiddled with the edges before taking a bite. A comfortable silence settled in. He realized how accustomed he'd grown to her quiet presence, how the hush in the penthouse no longer felt so empty. When she finished, she wiped her mouth on a napkin. "You sleep okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I had a weird dream about Mom," she admitted softly. "She and I were in a bookstore and I was trying to call you, but my phone kept falling apart." Christopher's chest tightened. "That sounds unsettling," he said gently. "Did you wake up scared?" She shrugged, pushing the rest of her bagel aside. "Not scared, just sad. I wish she was here, but I'm glad you are." After a moment, she added more quietly, "At least I'm not alone." He felt a surge of warmth at her words. "You're definitely not alone, Rosie. And I'm here however long you need." She mustered a fragile nod, then hopped down from her stool and wandered into the living room, leaving Christopher to gather the plates. He set them in the sink, reflecting on how much trust she'd begun to place in him. The shy, frightened girl who'd appeared at the hotel seemed worlds away from the girl in his kitchen. By late morning, Rosie had curled up on the couch with her library books. Christopher took the opportunity to catch up on emails, though he glanced her way frequently, half expecting she might retreat again. But she seemed engrossed in her stories, occasionally scribbling notes on a scrap of paper. When he finished his final email, he stretched and walked over to join her. She looked up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "There's this part in the book," she said, tapping the page, "about a kid who loses something really important. He searches everywhere, thinking he can't be happy without it. But then he realizes it was inside him the whole time, hope or something like that." Christopher smiled, taking a seat on the opposite end of the couch. "Sounds like a good message. Maybe that's what your mom believed too, that the strength you need is already inside you." She gazed down. "She used to say I was tougher than I looked. I never believed her." Her voice wavered on the admission. "I believe her," he said softly. "You're braver than you know." Rosie blushed and lowered the book, seeming both touched and flustered by his confidence. Before either could say more, the penthouse phone rang. Christopher stood and answered, expecting one of his associates, but it turned out to be the doorman. "Sir, there's someone asking to see you. A man named Damian Reed. Says it's about your guardianship filings." Christopher's pulse jumped. He recognized that name, an official from Family Court Services. "Send him up," he said, voice carefully controlled. Hanging up, he glanced at Rosie, who watched him with curious eyes. "Someone from the court is here," he explained. "They may want to ask a few questions." Her face paled. "Am I in trouble?" He shook his head at once. "No, not at all. They just have to follow procedures. That's all. Don't worry." Moments later, a short, silver-haired man stepped off the private elevator carrying a worn briefcase. He introduced himself as Damian Reed, a court-appointed assessor. Christopher offered him a seat in the living room, while Rosie lingered near the hallway, uncertain. Damian's demeanor was polite, but businesslike. He explained that he needed to verify the living arrangements for Rosie, confirm her welfare, and finalize details regarding Christopher's petition for legal guardianship. Rosie approached slowly, eyes darting to Christopher for reassurance. Damian smiled kindly, inviting her to sit. He asked a series of questions in a gentle tone about her routine, how she felt living with Christopher, and whether she felt safe. Rosie answered haltingly, but honestly, detailing how they spent most days, her reading, drawing, or attending therapy sessions, him occasionally working, but always checking in. She admitted she missed her mother terribly, but insisted Christopher was kind and provided everything she needed. Damian scribbled notes. Then he asked if he could see Rosie's bedroom, just to ensure it was suitable. She glanced at Christopher, who nodded and led the assessor down the hall. Christopher remained in the living room, tension coiling in his stomach. He trusted Rosie's account, but the idea of someone dissecting their private life made him uneasy. He dreaded a scenario where the court deemed him unfit simply because he'd never been a parent before. After several minutes, Damian re-emerged, Rosie trailing behind. Damian's expression was neutral as he settled back on the couch. "I appreciate your cooperation," he said, addressing Christopher. "Rosie's spoken highly of how you've helped her adjust. Normally, we'd require a more extensive evaluation, but given the circumstances and your resources, I see no immediate concerns." Christopher exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "So there won't be any issue finalizing guardianship?" he pressed, voice carefully calm. Damian shook his head. "I see no reason to deny the petition. Of course, final approval comes from the judge, but my recommendation carries significant weight. 1 or 2 more reviews may occur, but your living situation appears stable. Rosie seems well cared for, and you're addressing her emotional needs through therapy. We just have to ensure all the paperwork is in order. Once that's done, she'll be in your legal care indefinitely." Rosie's shoulders sagged with palpable relief. She stepped closer to Christopher, who placed a hand gently on her back. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Christopher said, voice resonating gratitude. "I appreciate your thoroughness." Damian stood, tucking his notes away. "I'll file my report within a few days. You'll hear from the court soon after." Then he gave Rosie a supportive nod. "You take care, young lady, and if you ever need anything, you can always reach out." She nodded quietly, hugging the book still clutched to her chest. Once Damian departed, an almost electric hush fell over the penthouse. Rosie turned to Christopher, eyes glistening. Are you really going to be my guardian?" she whispered. He crouched so they were at eye level, heart swelling at her vulnerability. "Yes, Rosie. If you want that, I promise to be here." His voice nearly cracked on the words. She breathed in, tears trembling at her lashes. "I do want that," she choked out, then flung her arms around his shoulders. He wrapped her in a gentle embrace, stunned and moved by how fiercely she clung to him. The last walls of uncertainty between them seemed to crumble, replaced by something warm and real. That night, Christopher ordered Rosie's favorite takeout, cheese pizza and a side of fries, and they watched an old animated movie in celebration. Though the official guardianship wasn't yet rubber-stamped, both sensed the final decision was all but certain. He noticed Rosie's laughter came more freely, the tension in her small frame easing. When the movie ended, she turned to him, still munching on the last fry. "Do you think Mom knows?" she asked, voice turning wistful. "That I'm safe now?" Christopher swallowed. "I like to believe she does," he said gently. "And I think she'd be happy we found each other." Rosie held his gaze, tears pooling but not falling. "Me too," she whispered. Then she curled up beside him, letting her head rest on his arm. He felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the softness of her hair brushing against his sleeve. It was the closest thing to family he'd felt in a very long time. The next day began with bright sunshine streaming into the penthouse. Rosie seemed to reflect that light, her step lighter than usual. She still had therapy in the afternoon, but in the morning, Christopher took her for a casual stroll around the block. They stopped at a small corner market, picking out fresh fruit. Rosie spotted a stand selling small potted succulents and paused. Each succulent sat in a painted ceramic pot. She chose a tiny one with a teal-colored container, smiling bashfully at Christopher. "Can we get this?" she asked, almost as if testing his willingness to humor small wants. "It might be nice for my desk." He set a hand on her shoulder. "Absolutely," he said, paying the vendor. Rosie carried the little plant carefully the whole way home, as though it were a treasure. Once inside, she placed it on her desk near Layla's notebook and photos, adjusting it until it caught the perfect slant of sunlight through the window. Minutes later, she stood back, hands on her hips, beaming at the transformation. "It looks happier here," she declared. Then she glanced over. "Have you ever had a plant before?" Christopher thought back. "I've had flowers delivered to my offices, but they never lasted long. No one really took care of them properly." He paused, then smiled. "But we'll make sure this one thrives, right?" She nodded fervently. "I'll water it and everything." The simple exchange left Christopher feeling a surge of affection. It wasn't about the succulent. It was about the life Rosie was rebuilding. Each new item she added to her room, each small routine she embraced, signaled another step away from the chaos of her grief and another step toward belonging. That afternoon, Rosie headed to her appointment with Dr. Addison. During the session, Christopher waited in the corridor with less anxiety than usual. He scrolled through messages on his phone, seeing missed calls from international contacts, a half-dozen texts from business partners, yet his mind stayed fixed on Rosie's well-being. When she finally emerged, Dr. Addison gave him a thumbs up. "Good progress today," the therapist said. "She's opening up more about Layla's final weeks. It's still painful, but she's letting herself grieve. That's important." Rosie walked beside him, hugging her arms around herself. "I told her how I felt guilty for not seeing how sick Mom really was," she admitted, voice trembling. "Dr. Addison said it wasn't my fault." Christopher gently rested a hand on her back. "She's right, Rosie. You couldn't have known, and there's nothing you could have done differently." Rosie swallowed, nodding, though tears glinted at the corners of her eyes. Once in the car, she leaned against the door, gazing at the city's passing skyline. After a few minutes, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you're here," she said in a small voice. He squeezed back, emotions constricting his throat. "Me too." They spent the evening quietly, each reading in the living room. Rosie devoured a new library book, while Christopher skimmed financial news to keep tabs on market trends. The hush between them wasn't awkward, but rather comfortable, a rhythm that felt more like home than any place Christopher had known. Occasional flickers of conversation broke the silence as Rosie pointed out something funny in her book, or Christopher remarked on the dramatic shifts in global stocks. It was an everyday moment, shared by two people forging a gentle bond. Before bedtime, Rosie slipped into Christopher's office, where he was sorting through guardianship forms. She stood there watching him with an unreadable expression. He looked up, setting aside the papers. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I just wanted to say good night." He smiled. "Good night, Rosie." For a brief instant she lingered, lips pressed together as though searching for words. Then she darted forward, offering a swift hug. Caught off guard, Christopher felt his heart leap. He held her close for that fleeting second, cherishing the trust she placed in him. As she pulled away, her eyes glistened. "Thanks," she whispered, disappearing down the hall. Left alone, Christopher exhaled slowly, brushing a hand across his face. Each new step Rosie took toward him was a testament to how far they had come. He thought of Layla once more, convinced she would approve of the home they were building. In that quiet moment, he pledged silently to keep their fragile family growing, protecting Rosie's newfound hope until it was strong enough to stand any storm. The following Saturday morning arrived with a crisp autumn breeze, rustling the yellowed leaves scattered along the sidewalks. Christopher stood at the penthouse window, sipping coffee as he watched early light spread over the city's skyline. Today was the day of Rosie's long-anticipated writing workshop at the library. He felt a twinge of nerves, hoping this event would be a positive milestone. Over the past week, she had mentioned the workshop only in passing, sometimes showing flashes of excitement, other times seeming hesitant about meeting new people. Rosie emerged from her bedroom with a folded sweatshirt draped over one arm. Her expression looked serious, as though she were bracing for something that both scared and intrigued her. At the kitchen table, she nibbled on toast, glancing at Christopher now and then. "Do you think I have to read out loud?" she asked softly, swirling her orange juice in the glass. He set his coffee down. "That's up to you," he replied gently. "No one can force you. If it feels too scary, you can just listen or share in smaller ways. I want you to enjoy it." She nodded, relief flickering across her features. After they finished breakfast, he gathered his keys and wallet, and they headed downstairs to the waiting car. During the drive, Rosie held her notebook in her lap, running her fingers over the worn cover. Christopher noticed how her gaze flicked between the city scenes outside and the lined pages in front of her. She was nervous. He understood too well what it meant to worry about being judged, especially when sharing something personal. They arrived at the library a few minutes early, following a small group of children and a friendly-looking woman carrying a tote bag stuffed with writing supplies. Rosie clutched Christopher's hand, just for a moment, before letting go and squaring her shoulders. Inside, the children's area had been rearranged to form a semicircle of chairs around a large table scattered with pencils, markers, and colorful paper. A volunteer greeted them, guiding Rosie to a seat while Christopher took a place near the back, not wanting to overshadow her. Other kids gathered, chatting or fidgeting, some accompanied by parents, others alone. A librarian stepped forward to introduce herself as Ms. Bennett, smiling broadly at the group. She explained how the session would work: a quick warm-up exercise, a short discussion, then time to write or draw. At the end, anyone who felt comfortable could share. Rosie's posture stiffened at the mention of sharing, but Christopher offered an encouraging thumbs up from his chair. She exhaled, flipping open her notebook. Soon the children were jotting down their favorite words, Ms. Bennett's prompt to spark creativity. Rosie wrote in small, neat script, chewing her lip in concentration. Occasionally, she glanced back at Christopher, who smiled each time. The air buzzed with low chatter and the scratch of pencils on paper. After 20 minutes, Miss Bennett asked if anyone wanted to read their favorite lines. A few hands went up, Rosie remained still. While a boy in glasses read a funny poem about a talking monkey, Christopher noticed Rosie's knuckles whitening around her notebook edges. When Ms. Bennet gently invited others to share, Rosie's head dipped. She seemed torn between longing and fear. Christopher stayed quiet, fighting the urge to nudge her. She had to decide on her own. At last, the session moved on to individual writing time. Rosie loosened her grip, setting her pencil to the page. Christopher watched her scribble for a while, expression shifting with each new sentence. She was in her element, for a moment forgetting the watchers around her. Ms. Bennet roamed, offering praise and gentle suggestions. When she reached Rosie's chair, Rosie tensed, but Ms. Bennet bent close, whispering encouragement that made Rosie nod. Christopher felt a burst of gratitude toward the librarian's kindness. When Ms. Bennet announced the final sharing opportunity, Rosie's shoulders went rigid again. 2 other children volunteered, reading imaginative short paragraphs about magical adventures. The room applauded politely. Christopher waited, heart in his throat, uncertain if Rosie would lift her hand. She didn't. As Ms. Bennet thanked everyone and declared the workshop over, Christopher stood, bracing for Rosie's disappointment at missing her chance. Yet the moment Ms. Bennet excused the group, Rosie suddenly inhaled, raising her hand halfway. "Can I share something?" she asked in a small voice. Ms. Bennet beamed. "Of course, come on up." She gestured Rosie to the front, and the children resumed their seats, curious. Rosie walked up, notebook trembling in her hands. Christopher caught her eye, mouthing a silent, "You can do it." She cleared her throat, opening to a page near the middle. Her voice trembled as she began. "This is a story about finding light in the dark." She read slowly, her pitch wavering on each sentence. The tale centered on a lonely child who discovered a hidden library at night, where books glowed with the memories of people long gone. Each glowing page offered guidance and comfort, leading the child to a new sense of belonging. Rosie's words were simple yet hauntingly tender, an obvious reflection of her own longing for closeness. As she neared the end, her voice hitched. She paused, blinking away tears. Ms. Bennet stepped forward, resting a supportive hand on her shoulder, but Rosie swallowed and finished the last line. "We carry their stories with us, so we're never truly alone." Silence engulfed the group. Then a ripple of applause began, first from Ms. Bennet, then the children, until everyone was clapping softly, respectful of the emotions Rosie's reading evoked. Christopher's chest felt tight with pride and concern for her quivering bravery. Rosie gave a small nod to the group, cheeks stained pink, before stepping back. As soon as Ms. Bennet dismissed them, Christopher hurried over. Rosie's eyes brimmed with tears, but her lips curved in a faint, triumphant smile. "You were amazing," he whispered, crouching beside her. "You showed such courage." She exhaled shakily. "I was so scared, but I'm glad I did it." Then, to his surprise, she added, "I think Mom would have liked that story." He squeezed her hand. "I know she would." They left the library with Rosie cradling her notebook, as though it contained a precious treasure. Outside, the autumn breeze carried scents of roasted chestnuts and damp leaves. Christopher asked if she'd like to grab lunch, and she nodded, offering a tentative suggestion of a nearby cafe. He felt relief that she'd chosen the place, a sign of her growing comfort in making small decisions for them both. The cafe was cozy, walls lined with used books for customers to browse. Rosie's eyes sparkled at the shelves, though she said nothing. They slid into a booth, ordering sandwiches and hot chocolate. While they waited, Rosie rested her chin on her hands, gazing around. "Someday," she said softly, "I'd like to work in a bookstore or library. Maybe I can help people find stories that make them feel less lonely." Christopher's throat tightened. He recalled Layla's dream of opening a bookstore. The fact that Rosie shared that longing felt symbolic. as though part of Layla's passion lived on in her daughter. "I bet you'd be great at that," he told her earnestly. "You've got a gift for understanding what people need to hear." Rosie smiled, a genuine, unguarded grin that made Christopher's heart lift. After their sandwiches arrived, they ate in companionable silence, exchanging only small remarks about the flavor or the decor. Then, near the end of the meal, Rosie set down her cup. "I'm scared about tomorrow," she confessed. He raised an eyebrow. "What's happening tomorrow?" She bit her lip, brow creasing. "Isn't that the day the court might call, or the day they do that final check on the guardianship stuff?" Christopher blinked, realizing she must have overheard him mention it to Natalie. "They might call, yes," he said gently. "We're expecting official news any day now." She fiddled with a napkin, twisting it nervously. "I'm afraid something will go wrong and they'll say I can't stay with you." Warmth surged in his chest at her admission. Leaning forward, he spoke earnestly. "Rosie, we've done everything right. I have the court's preliminary approval, and the assessor gave a positive report. I promise no one's going to take you away if I can help it." She nodded, blinking rapidly. "Okay," she whispered. She seemed less than fully convinced, but Christopher understood that her past had taught her to expect sudden upheaval. He silently vowed again to prove otherwise. When they returned home, Rosie retreated to her room. She carefully tucked her notebook onto the desk, then sat cross-legged on the star-patterned rug as though she needed a moment to absorb the workshop's emotional intensity. Christopher lingered in the doorway, not wanting to intrude. At last, she glanced up. "I might write another story tonight," she said. "Something about a girl and her father figure traveling around collecting lost books. That's okay, right?" His heart seized. Father figure. She'd never used those words before, even abstractly. Keeping his tone neutral, he replied, "Of course. Write whatever feels right to you. I'd love to read it whenever you're ready." She gave a small nod, returning her focus to the soft patterns under her fingertips. Sensing she needed space, Christopher left quietly, shutting her door part way. In the hallway, he paused to steady his breathing. The notion of fatherhood had seemed alien when Rosie first showed up in that hotel lobby. Now it felt closer to reality than anything else in his life. That evening, as dusk settled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Christopher prepared a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and chicken. Rosie helped set the table, moving in a subdued, thoughtful way. He asked about her writing workshop, and she recounted the other kids' stories, how one girl wrote about dragons living in her yard, and a boy had described a talking toaster. She giggled at the memory, then sobered. "I'm not used to sharing my thoughts with people," she admitted. "It made me feel exposed, but also less alone, I guess." Christopher nodded, placing the food on plates. "Sharing can be scary, but it connects us. It helps us see we're not the only ones who feel certain things." He handed her a plate. "And you did great." After dinner, they lounged in the living room, flipping channels. Nothing caught Rosie's interest until she stopped at a documentary featuring national parks. She settled back against the couch cushions, watching images of vast forests, deep canyons, and clear lakes. The narrator's soothing voice filled the silence. Occasionally, Rosie murmured about how incredible it would be to see such places in person. Christopher made a mental note. Perhaps when she was ready, they could plan a trip to somewhere peaceful and green. Maybe stepping outside the city would remind them both of life's bigger horizons. Before bed, they shared a few minutes looking over Rosie's library books. She returned them to her backpack, explaining she might read one more time before she drifted off. He listened quietly, admiring the thoughtful way she handled each volume. Just as she turned to leave, the phone chimed. Rosie's eyes widened, but Christopher raised a hand to keep her calm. He answered, voice steady. "Hello?" It was only a brief call from a colleague about an upcoming board decision. Christopher ended it swiftly. He noticed Rosie sagging with relief, a faint flush on her cheeks at how tense she'd become. "Tomorrow," she muttered. "We'll know soon, right?" He nodded. "Yes, and whatever happens, you'll be here with me." Her face softened, and she offered a quiet goodnight, disappearing into the hallway. Left alone in the hush of the penthouse, Christopher exhaled. He thought back to the library workshop, to Rosie's trembling voice as she read her story of hope and hidden libraries. Her bravery reminded him of how far she'd come and how far they both might go. Tomorrow's final phone call would likely confirm what they already felt, that Rosie was home. Yet she needed to hear the words made official, to banish any last fear she'd be uprooted again. He wandered into his own room, pushing aside business papers stacked neatly on the desk. Before climbing into bed, he paused by the window, city lights shining below. In that glow, he felt a surge of gratitude for the second chance fate had given him. In losing Layla, he had discovered Rosie, a child brimming with creative spark, fragile resilience, and the capacity to trust again. He silently promised that come what may, he would never let her down. Rosie woke before the sun fully rose, her mind too restless to remain in sleep. She peered at the clock just after 6 and realized she wouldn't be able to doze off again. In the soft light of her bedroom lamp, the walls bore gentle shadows of her new decorations, the star-patterned rug, the poster of the cozy bookshop, and her small succulent perched by the window. This was her room now, but she couldn't shake the anxiety creeping into her chest. The final call about guardianship was expected today, and her heart pounded at the thought of some unforeseen complication. She slipped from beneath the covers, crossing the penthouse hallway with tentative steps. Normally, Christopher rose later, but to her surprise, she found the kitchen light on. He stood by the marble countertop, dressed in casual clothes, sipping coffee and gazing at his phone. He glanced up when she approached, offering a quick, reassuring smile. "You're up early," he observed, placing his phone aside. "Couldn't sleep?" Rosie shook her head, hugging her arms. "Too nervous," she admitted. "Sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for," he said, pulling a stool out for her at the kitchen island. "I'm feeling it too." He slid a mug of warm milk her way. "Want to talk about it?" She stared down at the steaming liquid, torn between relief that he understood and fear of voicing her concerns. "I just keep thinking, what if something goes wrong? I know everyone says it won't, but I'm scared." Christopher nodded, understanding the fragility of her trust. "I'd be lying if I said there's zero chance of unexpected hiccups, but from everything our lawyer and the assessor have said, it's all but guaranteed. The judge just has to finalize the paperwork." Rosie gripped the mug with tense fingers. "What if the judge decides I should be somewhere else?" He set his own coffee down, meeting her gaze. "Even if the judge had concerns, we'd keep fighting. I would never just let them send you away, but believe me, the reports are all positive." She bit her lip, nodding slowly, then took a careful sip of her milk. Warmth spread through her, soothing at least the edge of her dread. In that moment, she took in his calm expression, the kindness in his eyes, and felt a small surge of gratitude. No matter the outcome, at least she wasn't going through this alone. Around 8 o'clock, they shared a simple breakfast of yogurt and fruit, neither speaking much. The air buzzed with unspoken tension. Christopher stepped away to review some paperwork for a potential business deal, but he stayed close enough that Rosie could hear his muted footfalls pacing near the living area. Occasionally the phone rang and she'd freeze, but it was always someone else, one of his colleagues or a telemarketer. Each false alarm seemed to tighten the knot in her stomach. By mid-morning, The tension became too much for Rosie to bear. She tiptoed into Christopher's study where he sat skimming a stack of documents. "Could we, I don't know, go somewhere?" she asked hesitantly. "I'm going to explode if we just wait here." He glanced up, sympathy in his eyes. "Of course," he said. "Let's go outside, maybe get some fresh air. The phone can forward messages to my cell. If the court calls, I won't miss it." She exhaled shakily, relief in her eyes. Within minutes, they were stepping out of the penthouse and into the brisk autumn sunshine. The sidewalk felt alive with passers-by, vendors selling coffee, and leaves swirling around gutter edges. Rosie stuffed her hands into her jacket pockets, walking close to Christopher as they navigated the morning bustle. They ended up at the same small park where they'd strolled once before, a modest green space with a central fountain and a row of benches under tall, golden-leafed trees. Christopher led her to a bench near the water where a few pigeons pecked at fallen crumbs. Rosie sat, gaze fixed on the fountain's gentle spray. "I used to come here sometimes," Christopher remarked softly, "when business deals stressed me out. The quiet helped me think." Rosie studied the interplay of sunlight on water droplets. "Was it enough?" He gave a rueful smile. "Often not. I'd still have to face the deal afterward. But it reminded me that the world is bigger than my problems." She nodded, mulling over his words. Then bravely she admitted, "I feel like I have no control. At least with writing, I can make things happen in stories. But this phone call, I can't force it to come or say what I want." Christopher reached out, resting a hand gently atop hers. "Sometimes letting go is the hardest part," he said. "But whatever news comes, I promise we'll handle it together." A flutter of gratitude flickered across her face, and she squeezed his hand once before letting go. They stayed a while, watching squirrels dart across the grass. At one point, Rosie rose to scatter a few breadcrumbs from her pocket for the birds. A child on another bench giggled as the pigeons converged, and Rosie smiled faintly at the sight. For a moment, time felt still, as though they could suspend their worries in the hush of the park. Then Christopher's phone buzzed sudden and loud in the peaceful space. Rosie's head snapped around, pulse racing. He fumbled for the device, checking the caller ID. "It's the court office," he said quietly, heart pounding. She darted over, standing close enough to hear the muted voice on the other end. Christopher pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello? Yes, this is Christopher Langford." A pause, during which Rosie held her breath. "Right, I understand. So is that official?" Another pause, and then his face lit with relief. "That's wonderful news. Thank you. We'll follow up with any paperwork needed." He hung up, exhaling, eyes bright with emotion. Rosie's heart hammered in her chest. What did they say?" she managed, voice trembling. "They said the judge has approved everything," Christopher replied, looking at her with quiet joy. "You're officially under my guardianship, Rosie. No strings attached." For a beat, Rosie seemed unable to process the words. Her lower lip quivered, and tears brimmed in her eyes. "So I can stay? Really stay?" He nodded, voice unsteady. "Really stay?" Rosie's breath hitched, and she flung her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. Christopher hugged her back tightly, overwhelmed by relief and tenderness. Nearby pigeons fluttered away at the sudden motion, but neither noticed. In that moment, the world was reduced to the beating of her heart against his, and the knowledge that her future was secure. Eventually, Rosie pulled back, face stained with tears. "I'm sorry," she hiccuped, wiping her cheeks. I'm so glad." Christopher's own eyes glistened. "Never apologize for tears, Rosie, especially not happy ones." They made their way home in a haze of joyous disbelief. Rosie kept sneaking glances at him, as if to confirm he was really there, and this was really happening. When they arrived at the penthouse, she bolted to her room, retrieved Layla's letter, and sat cross-legged on her bed, reading it over again. Christopher hovered in the doorway, unsure whether to join her. She noticed him and beckoned him over. "Mom wrote about how she wished she'd been able to give me more stability," Rosie said, voice raw with emotion. "She said if I ever found it, I should embrace it, not run away. I think she meant you, even though she didn't write your name. She said she'd always love me, but sometimes love meant trusting someone else to carry on what she couldn't." Christopher exhaled, a deep ache mingled with gratitude in his chest. "You can honor her by letting yourself feel safe here," he murmured. "She wanted that for you." Rosie nodded, placing the letter gently back into its envelope. For a moment her gaze shifted around the room, her rug, her posters, her notebooks. "I feel safe," she said softly. "And I think I'm ready to stop worrying that it'll vanish." He smiled. "That's all I could ever want to hear." They spent the afternoon celebrating in small, quiet ways. Rosie insisted on helping bake cookies, a recipe from one of Layla's old notes. Though she had to substitute a few ingredients, they turned out surprisingly good, filling the penthouse with a comforting aroma of melted chocolate and warm dough. Christopher watched Rosie bustle around the kitchen, laughing when flour dusted her nose. It was such a stark contrast to the timid girl who arrived weeks ago, weighed down by uncertainty and grief. After the cookies cooled, they curled up on the couch with mugs of milk, enjoying the sweet treats. Christopher realized how remarkably normal it felt, this cozy domestic scene. "You know," he ventured, "if you ever want to explore something like homeschool or return to a regular classroom, we should talk about it. Dr. Addison said we can figure out a plan that suits you best." Rosie nibbled a cookie, considering. "School might be okay," she admitted. "Eventually, but maybe I could start part-time or see if there's an arts program first. I don't want to just jump in with everything else going on." He nodded thoughtfully. "We'll go at your pace. You have options now. That's the beauty of it." She smiled, crumbs at the corner of her mouth. "You're not like any grown-up I've known. Most adults just tell kids what to do." Christopher shrugged, laughing softly. "Believe me, I never thought I'd be in this role. I'm learning every day." Rosie set her mug down, then shifted to face him fully. "Thank you," she said, voice low and sincere. "For everything, for not giving up, for caring, for letting me stay." Emotion swelled in his chest. He reached out, gently brushing a crumb from her cheek. "I should be thanking you," he said, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "You've changed my life more than you know." They ended up watching a movie later, though Rosie fell asleep halfway through, her head lolling against Christopher's arm. He muted the television, simply letting her rest. A few hours earlier, she'd been worried the phone call would shatter her world yet again. Now, she slept in peace, unafraid. He carefully lifted her in his arms, carrying her to bed. She stirred slightly, murmuring, "Is it time to go?" "No, you can keep sleeping," he whispered, tucking the blankets around her. The lamp cast a soft glow across her relaxed features, and he felt his heart tighten with affection. "You're home," he added quietly. "Everything's all right." In the hallway, he paused outside her door, realizing how seldom he ever paused like this in the past, always rushing, always aiming for the next big deal. But now, each moment with Rosie held a significance that no contract or stock option could match. She needed him, and he found that he needed her too in ways he was only beginning to understand. Days flowed into each other after that, each tinged with a calmer sense of certainty. No more waiting for official approval. No more tiptoeing around the question of Rosie's future. She was his ward, and he was her guardian. A fact that felt as natural as breathing. On a midweek afternoon, Natalie came by to review the final paperwork. Rosie offered her a cookie, and Natalie praised Rosie's baking talents. Then the conversation turned to scheduling. Rosie's therapy sessions, potential school visits, and even the possibility of a short trip if Christopher's work required him to travel. Rosie listened, perched on the arm of the couch, her cheeks coloring with excitement at the mention of traveling somewhere new. When Natalie finished, she gave Christopher a meaningful look. "I never expected to see you this settled," she teased gently, nodding toward Rosie. "But it suits you." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Believe me, I didn't see this coming either, but I'm grateful." As Natalie left, Christopher turned to find Rosie smiling at him. He realized her smile came more quickly these days, less hesitant. She no longer flinched when the phone rang or worried about being displaced. Slowly, they were carving out a life that bridged the ache of her past and the uncertain promise of tomorrow. That evening, they organized the penthouse's spare room into a small art and writing nook. Rosie helped move boxes while Christopher rearranged furniture. He purchased a second-hand easel and placed it near the window where daylight pooled. Rosie, eyes shining, rummaged through some art supplies and arranged them neatly, as though this space were an extension of her bedroom's sense of safety. By the time they were done, the air smelled faintly of cardboard dust and fresh beginnings. Christopher leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching Rosie survey the room. "A whole creative spot for your writing and drawing," he said, "whenever inspiration strikes." She turned, grin wide. "It's perfect," she whispered, hugging him on impulse. "Thanks, Dad." He froze. Her last word hung in the air like a chord reverberating, tender and startling. She pulled back, face flaming. "I'm sorry," she stumbled. "That just slipped out. Christopher swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Hey," he murmured, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. Really." He paused, searching her eyes. "If that's what you feel comfortable with, I'd be honored." Tears gathered in her lashes, but she blinked them away, nodding vigorously. "I do," she whispered. "I miss Mom, but you're here. You're caring for me. It feels right." Christopher's heart felt like it might burst. "Then it's settled," he said softly. "Thank you for letting me be that person in your life." Rosie pressed her lips together, as if sealing the moment. Then, with a small breath of determination, she smiled. "I love it," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "All of this. It finally feels like home." Christopher rose early, drawn from sleep by a subtle anticipation that tingled through him. Weeks had passed since the guardianship became official, and the routine he shared with Rosie had settled into something steady, almost normal. This morning, as he stepped into the living room, he found her curled in an armchair near the windows, reading a library book by the warm glow of a floor lamp. She glanced up when she heard his footsteps, offering him a peaceful smile that still caused his chest to tighten with gratitude. "Good morning," she said, closing the book. "I was just waiting for you. I had an idea." He poured himself a small cup of coffee before settling on the couch. "Tell me," he encouraged, watching how her eyes shone with careful excitement. Rosie fiddled with the corner of her bookmark. "Well, we haven't really gone anywhere, like outside the city together. I was thinking about that place Mom used to love, Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn." Her voice caught on a tremor. "I know she's buried there. Maybe we could visit. You haven't been since I found you in that hotel lobby, and I haven't gone for a while either." He drew a slow breath, remembering the last time he'd stood by Layla's grave, the day everything shifted. "If you're sure you want to," he said gently, "I'll take you, whenever you feel ready." She nodded, expression solemn. "I think it's time. I want to show her I'm okay." They decided to leave after breakfast, gathering coats to guard against the brisk November chill. During the short drive, Rosie gazed through the window at the changing landscape, gray skies overshadowing the tall buildings. Christopher occasionally glanced at her, wishing he could offer reassurance beyond silent presence. Visiting a grave often stirred up powerful feelings, and he worried about how deeply it might affect her. But the determination in Rosie's posture told him this was her choice and she would face it bravely. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, wrought iron twisting into an ornate arch. Beyond them, winding paths threaded through rolling lawns dotted with headstones, ancient statues, and tall, bare-limbed trees. Christopher parked along a quiet lane, cutting the engine. For a moment, neither moved. Rosie swallowed, then pushed open the door. He followed, tucking his hands into his coat pockets as a sharp breeze brushed his face. Rosie led the way along a gravel path, her steps slow, eyes scanning the markers. At last, they reached a modest headstone marked with Layla's name. Rosie halted, breath catching. Christopher stood back, offering her space. An iron bench sat nearby, and he lowered himself onto it, letting her approach the grave alone. For several minutes, she simply stared at the engraved letters. The wind rustled leaves across the grass. Finally, Rosie knelt, pulling a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. Christopher realized with a pang that it must be a short letter, or perhaps a poem. She placed it gently at the foot of the stone. "Hi, Mom," she whispered, voice edged with sorrow. "I wrote you something, about how I'm doing, about how I met Christopher. You were right to trust him. He's looked after me, given me a home, more than I could have hoped for." Her voice faltered. She paused, pressing trembling lips together. Christopher's throat thickened, memories flickering. Layla's vibrant smile, the hushed regret when she spoke about wanting more stability. He wondered if she ever imagined this moment, her daughter visiting with the man she once cared for, in a way that changed everything. Leaning forward, he ran a hand over his face. Rosie inhaled shakily, forcing herself to continue. "I'm safe," she managed. "I go to therapy. I write stories. Sometimes about you and me. I'm still sad you're gone, but I think you'd be proud of what we have now. I have a family, and I love you forever." Tears broke free then, and Christopher stood, crossing the small distance to kneel beside her. She turned into him, pressing her face against his coat sleeve, sobbing quietly. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, letting her grief wash over them both. In the hush of that sacred place, he could almost feel Layla's presence, perhaps not literally, but in the sense that her hope for Rosie's future was finally fulfilled. When the sobs subsided, Rosie wiped her cheeks. She laid a single white lily, one she'd brought from the city, on the grave. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come," she murmured, "but I'm here now." They lingered a while, lost in thought. The cemetery's tranquility offered a strange comfort, its wide pathways drawing quiet visitors who paid respects to loved ones. At some point, Christopher pressed a gentle kiss to Rosie's hair. "You ready to go?" he asked softly, and she nodded, though she cast one final longing glance at Layla's resting place before rising. Walking back to the car, they didn't speak much, but the silence felt purposeful, like both were processing the depth of that visit. As they passed under the iron gates again, Rosie let out a slow breath. "Thank you," she said, slipping her hand into Christopher's as they reached the car. "I really needed that." He squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you shared it with me." They drove to a nearby cafe for lunch, the kind that served homemade soups and warm bread. The contrast between the cemetery's somber hush and the cafe's bustling chatter felt jarring, but in a good way, life continuing amid reflection. They found a corner table, both still subdued. Rosie played with her spoon, gazing at a candle flickering on the tabletop. "You know," she said, voice tentative, "I think I feel lighter now." like visiting her and telling her I'm okay. Lets me move forward without so much guilt. Does that make sense? Christopher leaned closer. Yes, it does. Sometimes giving ourselves permission to say goodbye in our own way helps us find peace. She nodded, tears threatening again but not quite falling. That's it. Peace. They finished lunch and returned to the penthouse under a milky sky. Rosie excused herself to her room, saying she wanted to write everything down while it was fresh. Christopher let her go, proud of how she managed her own emotions with surprising maturity. She was no longer the frightened child who showed up on his doorstep. She'd grown into someone who confronted her pain head-on, shaping it into words and stories. Later, as twilight spread across the skyline, Rosie emerged wearing a soft sweater and holding a small scrap of paper. She asked Christopher if they could sit together in the living room. Once settled, she cleared her throat. I wrote a poem, she said shyly. About Mom, about us, about feeling safe. He nodded, urging her to continue. Her cheeks turned pink, but she glanced at the paper and began. The poem was simple yet resonant. She described how grief could be like a fog, making all paths look the same. She mentioned that a single light, shining steady, could guide someone out of it. She didn't name Christopher, but it was clear who she meant. When she finished, Christopher's eyes shone with emotion. That's beautiful, he said, voice husky. Thank you for sharing it. Rosie folded the paper carefully. I want to keep it in Mom's notebook, she told him. It feels like it belongs there. He smiled, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Good idea. You know, Layla would have been thrilled to see how talented you are with words. Rosie exhaled, the corners of her mouth lifting. Sometimes I feel closer to her when I write, like I'm doing something she cared about. His heart clenched at her vulnerability, yet he was also reassured by her openness. Keep writing, he said softly. Keep discovering who you are. That night he made dinner while Rosie arranged the table. Each small routine felt significant, a layer of new memories forming a tapestry over the heartbreak she'd endured. After they ate, Christopher ventured a suggestion. What if we take a short trip next weekend? Somewhere quiet, maybe upstate, where the leaves are changing. You've said you wanted to see more than just the city. Rosie brightened, her eyes sparking. Really? Just us? He nodded. Yes, a little getaway. We can walk in the woods. Maybe find a small bookstore in a nearby town just to breathe fresh air. Her grin widened. That sounds amazing. I've never really been outside the city, at least not to the countryside. Mom always wanted to go, but it never happened. Christopher's chest filled with warmth. Then let's make it happen. We can look for a place tonight and book it. She practically bounced with excitement, gratitude shining in her face. Yes, let's do it. After cleaning up, they sprawled on the couch, browsing destinations on his tablet. Rosie's eyes roamed photos of cabins, lakes, and winding trails lined with fiery autumn foliage. Eventually, they picked a small bed and breakfast near a nature reserve. Rosie insisted on picking a room that had a view of the forest, wanting to wake up to trees rather than skyscrapers. Once the reservation was confirmed, Rosie let out a contented sigh. This is really happening, she murmured, hugging a throw pillow. A road trip, a real one. Christopher marveled at her excitement, reminded how such a simple plan could mean the world to someone who'd had so little stability. It's our adventure, he said, ruffling her hair. We'll bring your notebook so you can capture every thought. She laughed, swatting at his hand. Yeah, definitely, I'll write about everything. Time slipped by as they chatted about possible activities, collecting fallen leaves, reading on the porch, maybe even stargazing if the skies were clear. Eventually, fatigue dimmed Rosie's enthusiasm and she yawned, eyes drooping. Christopher guided her to her bedroom, flicking on the lamp. She set her poem gently atop the notebook that once belonged to Layla, then turned back to him. "Good night, Dad," she said, voice soft but sure. She had grown more comfortable calling him that, each utterance healing a bit more of her fear. A surge of emotion welled in his chest. "Good night, Rosie," he whispered. "See you in the morning." He left her with the warm glow of the lamp illuminating her safe, welcoming space. In the corridor, he paused at his own door, reflecting on the day. They had faced the memory of Layla together, paid respects at her grave, and emerged stronger, more bonded than ever. The guardianship was no longer just a legal arrangement. It was a testament to their shared faith in building a life from the wreckage of sorrow. In his room, Christopher changed into pajamas, mind spinning with plans for their weekend away. He could imagine Rosie beaming at the sight of open fields and turning leaves, a pastel mosaic across the hills. Perhaps they'd sip hot chocolate on a wooden deck. He pictured her leaning over her notebook, describing all she saw in that unique, heartfelt way. The thought filled him with an unfamiliar but profound sense of contentment. As he flicked off the light, he couldn't help recalling the very first night she'd arrived, exhausted, alone, clutching her backpack in the hotel lobby. He remembered how lost he'd felt, uncertain if he could ever be what she needed. Now, with each shared meal, each conversation, he realized he had stepped into a role that felt less like a duty and more like a calling. Layla had trusted him enough to name him, in her own private way, as the one person who might protect Rosie. And though Christopher still mourned the silence and misunderstandings that once kept them apart, he was determined to honor her belief. Sleep came swiftly, carrying him into dreams where he walked through a sunlit forest with Rosie at his side, the leaves overhead glowing gold. In those dreams, he felt the same warmth that now guided him in waking life, the knowledge that, despite life's unexpected challenges, they had found each other just in time. In the morning, he would wake to the gentle presence of the girl who called him Dad, and they would keep building upon this new foundation. The loss of Layla would always be a scar, but in that scar's place, love had taken root, quietly and irreversibly, nurturing them both toward a future worth embracing. You've liked this story? Please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends.